I worked myself to death and woke kneeling with a bouquet, mocked as the ultimate scoundrel before the cold swordswoman Sophia Ward. Now I was Rain Grey, a talentless waste at a magic academy in a dying age of magic, secretly holding the ancient book that knew all magic. They set me up to lose a duel in rigged anti-magic stone armor, so I floated glowing into the sky and unleashed every element at once. The waste they laughed at was the only all-attribute mage alive. Punch the like button and ring the subscribe bell so you stay in the loop. Every click moves the needle, but every fortune begins in a small room. Let me show you mine. The first thing I felt was the weight of a bouquet in my hands. It made no sense. A heartbeat earlier, I had been face down and drooling across my office desk. Now I knelt on one knee on a wide stone path. A crowd of students in strange academy uniforms ringed me, every one of them watching like I was the day's free entertainment. My hands were not my hands. They were paler and finer, the hands of a man who had never filed a report in his life. A woman stood over me in light armor, her hair pulled into a single cold ponytail, and she looked down at me the way you look at a stain on the carpet. She spoke slowly. She told me she was not considering marriage for now and asked whether my father knew I had come to propose. Not one of those words belonged to me, not marriage, not proposal, not my father. I still half believed I was dreaming, that any moment I would wake to cold vending machine coffee and an inbox full of grievances. But the petals were too real. The murmur of the crowd was too real. The ache in my knees was very real. Before I could form one clear thought, steady voices cut through the crowd, mixed with the clank of armor. Guards with a lion crest on their breastplates shoved through the students. Without a word, two of them seized me under the arms and hauled me up. The bouquet slipped from my fingers and scattered across the stone. Their grip crushed muscles that had never known labor, and the pain burned away the last of my doubt. This was not a dream. In some earlier life I had been So Woo, a nobody drone worked to the bone on a world called Blue Star. That tired soul had been poured whole into this body. I had transmigrated fully and absurdly into a stranger's disaster. Wonderful. My first act in a new world was a public rejection and a frog march off the path. The students drifted apart behind me, already trading the scene as gossip. From the scraps I caught, the boy they had watched crash and burn was called Rain, the household's resident scoundrel. A boy like that was expected to do any deranged thing under the sun. A ceramic teacup shattered on the polished floor a hand's width from my knee. I was kneeling again, this time in a luxurious study. A broad, thick-shouldered man had surged up from behind his desk with murder in his eyes. He demanded to know what glorious deed I thought I had done, declaring my love for Sophia Ward before the whole academy. Of every woman in the empire, he thundered, why did it have to be her? Then his fist came down on the desk. The whole slab of hardwood pulverized into splinters, yet the floor beneath it stayed flawless. The control it took to shatter one and spare the other was terrifying. He roared that he was Ford Grey, a 6th-rank Moon Knight, the proudest lion of the Grey family. He could not fathom how he had fathered a waste like me. A pressure rolled off him as he said it, heavy and animal. The man at his side, sharp in a butler's suit, murmured a single word to settle him, and called him patriarch. This was Jonas, head butler of the Grey House, and our marquis family's quiet spine. His reminder was enough to make Ford draw a slow breath and pull the aura back inside. I stayed on my knees, lost. I had been awake 10 minutes, and already a furious lion was tearing strips off me for a crime I could not remember. He cursed at me again and asked whether I knew how much trouble I had caused. Then my skull split open from the inside. A tidal wave of memories that were not mine came crashing in, names and faces and years of another boy's life. I clutched my head and pressed my forehead to the cool floorboards, desperate to dull the pain. Ford accused me of faking sickness again, the way I supposedly did every time I made a mess. But Jonas frowned. He crossed the room, laid a hand on my head, and sent a thread of battle chi through me to read my condition. Whatever he felt made him shake his head, and that small motion shut the patriarch up at once. The last thing I managed before the dark took me was to slump sideways against the floor. Upstairs, the butler carried the unconscious young master to his room and warned the maids not to disturb him until the physicians arrived. When the butler came back down, a fresh desk had already replaced the ruined one. Ford sat behind it, frowning at the grain, turning over how to clean up his son's mess. The trouble was Sophia Ward. She was the brightest prodigy the Ward family had ever produced. A 2nd-rank intermediate knight at only 18, the youngest in the whole Ecclesia Empire to reach that rank. The Wards were a marquee house exactly like the Greys, both with knight orders and warrior regiments of their own that made them as strong as dukes in all but name. A talentless boy's public confession could be waved off as puppy love. It could also be read as the Greys reaching to bind themselves to the Wards. If Ford were the emperor, he too would grow suspicious, because the two houses joined could rival the imperial line. The only question now was how to make the emperor lower his guard. A knock came, and at Ford's word a lush, richly dressed woman stepped in. Even the old lion's face softened at the sight of her. He asked why Lila had come, and waved at Jonas to fetch her a seat. Lila Russell settled into the chair and told her husband he was still stewing over the boys' disaster. Ford admitted it, saying the brat caused trouble daily and this time had buried them. She drew documents from her magic guide ring and laid out the fix. His real fear, she said, was the Emperor misreading the confession and turning suspicion on the Greys. Her advice was to move before the rumor could ferment, find the boy a wife at once, then manufacture some petty friction with the wards, and the Emperor would read their intentions and stop believing the gossip. She tapped the top document and named the girl she had already vetted, one Adele Hill, adding that her people found her a fine match. Ford's eyes brightened as he set down his cup and began paging through the dossier. I came back to the world flat on my back in an enormous bed, an elderly man in physician's robes leaning over me. He pronounced me fine, nothing but a temporary rush of blood, and left a set of soothing potions to drink 1 bottle a day for a week. Eve Julie, our head maid, took them, thanked the old physician, and walked him down to his carriage. Once she was gone, I told the maids twittering around my bed to clear out and give me quiet. They bowed and filed out, one after another. I fell back onto the mattress and stared at the ceiling while the sunset poured gold through the tall windows. In my last life, I had been a disposable office worker on Blue Star, a graduate of a diploma mill coasting on relief. Now here I was in a world of swords and sorcery. Except the sorcery was mostly a rumor. Magic in this era was a withered, dying thing, and people called it the Age of End Magic. Centuries ago, a single empire had ruled the whole Soltis continent, and its king, for some unknown reason, ordered every mage slaughtered and every spellbook burned. The profession never recovered. Real power now came from cultivating battle chi through breathing techniques, turning yourself into a knight, a warrior, or an assassin. A few people still walked the mage's path, but only a few. They were starved of spellbooks and meditation techniques, cursed with a talent so rare that maybe one human in 10,000 could manage it. That was the cruel joke of the boy whose body I wore. As heir to a knight family, he had ached to cultivate battle chi, and he could not, born without a scrap of the talent. Even the Grey family's peerless, fearless line-breathing method could do nothing for him. What he had instead was a magic talent so absurd it defied belief, an all-attribute gift for every element there was, lightning and light and darkness, and even space. It should have made him a laughingstock. No meditation technique in the world was fine enough to feed a talent that vast. He was a 6-cylinder engine that had only ever been fed water. Somewhere along the way, the original Rain gave up and became the spoiled thug everyone expected, throwing the Grey name around to bully and brawl. I sorted through his memories and could only laugh at the hand I had drawn. The one mercy was that this idiot had abandoned noble etiquette years ago. That meant I would never have to sweat which fork announced a coup. A knock interrupted me, and I called for whoever it was to enter. Eve pushed a dining cart up beside the bed and told me it was time to change and eat, and that tonight there was my favorite, the azure lobster tail. I turned my head and looked at her properly. She was tall and mature, built in a way her uniform could barely contain. When she caught my gaze, she offered, perfectly evenly, to attend me in bed if the madam gave her leave. I sat up, shook my head, and let her dress me instead, since I had survived far too much today for that. A composed older sister type like Eve was exactly my weakness. This wicked new world of mine was really not so bad. As she fastened my shirt, she paused at a necklace against my collarbone and asked where it came from, since it looked oddly like a little book. I glanced down and went cold. It was mine. It was the cheap pendant I had bought off a street stall back on Blue Star, the one shaped like a shut book, and it had crossed over with me. My golden finger, maybe. The one cheat every transmigrator was owed. I told Eve as flatly as I could that I had picked it up recently because I liked the look, and she nodded and let it drop. She buttoned me into soft, silk-smooth loungewear, wheeled the cart to my bedside, and lifted the silver lids off the dishes. The moment the lids came off, the room flooded with the smell of the sea, of fruitwood smoke, of fresh herbs. My mouth watered on reflex. One plate held the pale blue tail of a lobster from the South Sea, a delicacy so dear that shipping it to the capital cost no less than 5 gold coins. Another held a hind leg of brute boar, the kind of meat that nourished battle chi. I had none to nourish, but my mother had me eat it daily anyway, praying for a miracle that was never coming. Eve drew out a crystal goblet and red wine, wiped the glass, poured it half full, and tied a napkin at my throat. I did not bother with a single rule of noble dining, since food this good demanded to be devoured. Eve watched me tear into it without judgment. A prim little lord at this table would have been far stranger to her. I cleaned the plate, trading bites of meat for sips of wine, and swore I had never eaten anything so good in either life. Eve wiped the sauce from my mouth and passed along the master's order. I was confined to the estate for now, forbidden to leave without his say-so. I nodded and she wheeled the cart back out. The second the door shut, I pulled the necklace off and cradled the little book-shaped charm in my palm. It had followed me across death and worlds, so it had to be something extraordinary. If only I could switch it on. For half an hour I tried every stupid thing I could think of. I held a flame to it, drowned it in water, squeezed a drop of blood onto it, and nothing happened. Then I fed it the thin trickle of mana I had. The charm drank the mana and flipped open with a papery rustle, as if a wind had caught its pages. Then it dissolved into a ribbon of light and poured straight into my head. I dropped like a cut string across the bed. Inside my own mind, a book was waiting. It was enormous and ancient, heavy with the weight of centuries. It stood at the center of my thoughts and simply let me know its name. It was the Book of Arts. It held every breathing technique and battle technique the Soltis continent had ever known, every meditation technique, spell, and secret art. Feed it enough energy, and it would hand me whichever technique I desired. It could even drop me into a state of pure epiphany while I learned. And because it had only just woken, it would let me claim any one method or skill free of charge, this first time. My breath came heavy as I stared at it. This was how a dead-end waste rewrote his fate against the heavens. I stepped forward and told it what I needed above all was a meditation technique that fit my talent. The pages began at once to riffle and turn on their own. The book settled open on a single page and let me read what it had chosen. It was a world-class meditation technique, the highest tier that existed, and it was called Heaven Abyss Meditation. No human hand had made it. It had formed on its own inside the Heaven Abyss magic cave, born of heaven and earth, and no one lacking all attribute talent could learn it and live. But for someone like me, it would turn my mana into a boundless ocean, expanding my capacity without limit, drinking in the world's mana even while I slept. I marveled at how grandly the book had opened its account with me. This was the sort of technique the legends said could carry a mortal up to the rank of a god. Without hesitation, I laid my hand on the book, and a torrent of golden light roared out of it into my body. It was the same searing pressure as the night I absorbed the boy's memories, only worse, a headache vast enough to split a mountain. I gritted through it. Slowly, the pain gave way to a deep, dark gold mana settling into me, the unmistakable current of the heaven abyss. I had done it, and in my spiritual world I threw back my head and roared at the empty sky. That one technique dragged me from a middling apprentice past the advanced stage into a tier 1 mage overnight. The heaven abyss had swollen my reserves tenfold, and for a mage that was everything. Raw mana was a mage's true weapon. The more I held, the more I could cast, and the harder I struck with no muscle memory or years of drills. I was a mage now, a proper noble mage, and the thought was intoxicating. The book had gone dim after its gift, spent to the last drop. I made up my mind to hunt down every energy-rich treasure I could find and pour them all down its throat. I surfaced from my spiritual world and woke on the bed, the dark gold mana still humming through me. I called for my personal maid, Cecily Levin, and she slipped in at once, head bowed, eyes on the floor, and asked in a small voice whether I had summoned her. The fear on her face hit me first. Along with it came a rush of the original boy's memories, ugly ones, of this same white-haired girl being struck again and again. I could not help pitying her. Whatever sins the last tenant of this body had racked up, how could anyone raise a hand to a girl this gentle? I made my voice as soft as I could and told her to come closer. Instead, she dropped to her knees, her words breaking around a sob, begging me not to hit her when she had done nothing wrong. I stood and walked toward her, and the fear in her eyes only sharpened. She seemed to simply resign herself to whatever was coming. Then I lifted her up, carried her to the bed, and sat her down, and she stared at me like a rabbit in a wolf's den. I rolled back her sleeve and my expression went hard at the bruises mottling her arm. I told her to find Jonas and get a jar of blood-activating jade ointment, then have someone bring the magic books I had thrown out earlier. She only stood there, dazed, until I said her name again with an edge, and she jolted awake and hurried out. Before long, she came back with other maids hauling stacks of magic books, spell manuals, and meditation techniques of every kind. Once they set them down, the others fled, and Cicely held out the ointment to me. I did not take it. I told her instead that she was still far too timid, and her eyes welled up as she apologized. Then I pointed at the jar and told her to find Eve and have her wounds treated, since they were an ugly thing to look at. She hesitated over the precious ointment and mumbled that there was no need, that the injuries would heal on their own. I frowned, put on my sternest face, and asked whether she was really about to disobey her young master now. That was all it took. She swore she would run to Sister Eve that instant, and as she scurried off, I called after her to use every drop, since I would check with Eve later. Once Cecily was gone, I settled in with the pile of magic books. Everyone had been hunted down by my father over long years, each carrying the dust of history and a price that could ransom a small town. I opened the first, waved away the trapped dust, and found a treatise on the magic array behind a tier 1 spell called Thunder Spear. A mage cannot simply will a spell into being. He must construct a magic array first and channel the spell through it, and those arrays were why magic was so punishing to learn. Under the book's enlightenment, a text that should have been impenetrable unfolded like a children's primer. Inside 10 minutes, the Thunder Spear was mine. The next book was a fire meditation technique, and I tossed it aside at once. I joked to myself that I had better hide it before the heaven abyss caught sight of it and got the wrong idea. The third taught me a barrier spell, and the fourth a movement art called Gale Speed, and both fell into my hands without a struggle. I was reaching for the fifth when Cicely came back and set the empty ointment box at my side, reporting she had used it all as ordered. I nodded and pushed it aside without opening it. The girl would sooner die than lie to me. The sky had gone dark, so I told her to go to bed, and she bowed and left. A moment later, she was back with a silver basin, telling me to wash up first, and I did not argue. I washed up with the basin she offered and lay down. She doused the magic lamp and slipped out, and I was asleep almost before my head found the pillow. That same night, out in the royal capital, the Grey family shadows went to work. In the back courtyard of the Smile morning newspaper, masked men in black ringed the shop's owner where he cowered on the ground. He groveled that he would never dare invent stories about young Master Rain, since a commoner with no noble patron was worth less than a dog in a lord's house. The leader clapped him on the shoulder and let the threat hang half-finished. The owners swore in the name of the god of knights that if a single word about young Master Rain ran tomorrow, his whole family could forfeit the god's mercy forever. The black-clad men melted back into the dark, and the owners sat shivering long after they were gone. This rough handling was only for papers with no noble backing. Those with patrons were left to Jonas to negotiate. Ford had caught the story early, and over that single night the scandal was quietly smothered. Morning found the gray dining hall glittering under a crystal chandelier, the long table dressed in red silk and set with gold-chased silver. My father and mother were already eating when I shuffled in yawning and dropped a lazy greeting on the room. Eve slid my chair out and I sank into it. Neither parent said a word, since I had not observed a scrap of table etiquette in years. Eve tried to hand me a full setting of cutlery and I waved it off, making do with bread and a cup of milk. I was already on my feet to leave when my mother stopped me. She told me she had chosen a young lady, the youngest daughter of the Hill family, gentle-natured, my own age, and by all accounts a beauty, and that we would be engaged in 3 months. She would come to meet me a few times, so I was to clean up, behave, and cause no trouble at the academy. I frowned on reflex and reminded her she had promised me a marriage of my own choosing. That set my father off at once. He barked whether I was still chasing Sophia and said that if he had not caught wind of it early, there was no telling what would have happened. My mother patted his arm and told him not to work himself into a temper before breakfast was even done. He subsided with a grumble that a son like me would shave 20 years off his life. She came around the table and walked me through the whole disaster the old Rain had made, and by the end, I had nothing to say. The boy had been a prize fool, unable to appreciate the small army of maids under his own roof and instead running off to confess in public and blow up the family standing. I only sighed that I understood, and hoped the hill girl at least met my standards. At the table, my father raised an eyebrow and remarked that the boy might actually have reached Tier 1 mage. My mother had never tracked her son's cultivation and only told him to eat and hurry, since the Emperor was expecting him. Ford let it drop. A Tier 1 mage was nothing to marvel at, only the baseline any noble child of the Empire was meant to clear. Out in the hallway, the maids I passed dipped into bows one after another. I looked over their faces and figures and could not help thinking any one of them beat that flat-chested Sophia by a mile. I made my way to Jonas's room and knocked. He had been up all night, but that old she made all-nighters a small thing for him. When he saw it was me, he shot to his feet and asked what I needed. I came to him so rarely, never more than a handful of times a year, and always because I had detonated some catastrophe too large to bring to my father. The poor man had already braced to clean up another mess, so when I asked whether the family had any treasures that could raise a mage's power, the relief that washed over him was almost comic. He told me that yes, of course we did, and offered to take me down to the family vault to pick for myself. He led me into a heavily guarded underground warehouse, through 5 layers of barriers and lockdowns, and produced a jade medallion to pass the last. The staff came forward the moment the door sealed, greeting me and the steward and asking what we needed. I gaped at the sheer size of the place, since it was my first time inside. Jonas told the keeper, a man named Boao, that I wanted treasures to strengthen magic. Boao led us to a wall of tall cabinets that looked like library shelves. Because magic had fallen out of fashion, he explained, magic treasures went for far less than battle chi treasures of the same grade. The Greys had spent recent years buying them up until 5 great cabinets stood full, each holding dozens, low grade and high. I stepped up to the row, and all at once faint numbers bloomed across my vision, one hovering over every cabinet. My eyes went wide. The book could actually read the raw energy locked inside each treasure and paint the total in front of me. I pulled open the nearest cabinet on a whim. Boao named its contents, an ice stone, a Tier 1 treasure quarried from the extreme hidden snow mountain in the north, a decent boost for any ice mage below Tier 2. Over the stone, in my sight alone, a small pale gold figure glimmered barely into the 20s. I looked across the dense scatter of numbers spread over all 5 cabinets, smiled at Boao, and told him to wrap the whole lot up for me. Wrap all of it up for me. I said it again, and Boao stared as if he could not trust his ears and asked carefully what I had just said. I repeated it a 3rd time, plainly, that I wanted all 5 cabinets packed and carried out. His eyes blew wide. The easy smile on my face must have looked positively demonic, because he shot a desperate glance at Jonas, hunting for rescue. Jonas mastered his own shock, and asked gently what on earth I meant to do with so many treasures. I told him I meant to use them, obviously, since I could hardly be planning to sell them. That left him at a genuine loss. I was one of only 2 direct heirs of the Grey family, so taking most of the vault was within my rights, even if taking every piece was not. But my track record made him uneasy, and the one man who could authorize it, my father, was already on the road to the palace. After a moment, Jonas landed on a compromise. Since he had noticed I reached Tier 1 Mage, he explained the terms. Hauling away everything needed the Patriarch's word, which he could not give, but he could let me take whatever I could currently use. I let it go without a fight. Carting off the whole vault had never been realistic, and I had only blurted it in the flush of excitement. I nodded and told him that was fine. The relief on his face doubled. By every past encounter, the old Rain would have thrown a tantrum and stormed off, and my easy agreement told Jonas the young master was in an uncommonly good mood. He gave Boao a nod, and Boao rounded up a few staff to collect every treasure I could presently use. Then he walked me back up to my ground floor room, took his leave, and left me to my books. My rank had jumped to Tier 1 Junior Magician the moment I swallowed the Heaven Abyss, but that only put me at the level of a common noble's son, and my lazy predecessor had barely learned a single combat spell. I needed to consolidate, and badly. So for an hour I read, until the staff arrived with a small mountain of treasures and set it down in my room. I slotted each piece into my magic guide ring one by one. Then I stretched the ache from my shoulders and called for Cecily. The maid who answered was one I could not name, and she edged in to say Cecily had the day off until tomorrow. I asked her name. She said I could call her Maeve, so I told her to massage my shoulders and stretched out on the bed. Maeve slipped off her shoes, climbed up, and set to work with a pleasant pressure. I turned toward her long, fiery red hair and told her it was beautiful. The work loosened her, and I could all but hear her thinking the young master was not the monster the rumors painted. She said she was born in the royal capital, her red hair natural, and that she was glad if it pleased me. I could not resist a playful pinch at the soft flesh of her thigh, and she yelped, her face scarlet. For a maid to catch the young master's eye was the highest honor there was. I let my hand wander a moment longer, then left her be, since my real taste ran to the more mature sort. The hour drifted by in a lazy half-cuddle, little hearts creeping into Maeve's eyes. She even dared to act coy with the man the capital called vicious, until I sent her off with a pout. I felt loose and easy, and picked a book back up and read until my mind tired, then pulled out treasures to meditate on. A little over 50 pieces had arrived at noon, most of them Tier 1, and I split them down the middle, feeding half to the book and keeping half. The dozen or so I absorbed myself pushed my own source energy up toward 500 points. My hand turned the ancient pages as the hours ran like water, and once again the sunset found me still reading. Under the book's enlightenment, I finished the whole small mountain of manuals in a single day. My grasp of magic broadened all at once, systematic and deep, fire and lightning and ice and the rest, until I had even dabbled in healing. I stretched, rubbed my temples and rose, hollowed out by a full day of revelation. I did not bother calling Maeve to help me wash. I only killed the lights and dropped into bed. Cecily's clear voice woke me the next morning, warning me to get up or I would be late. I blinked at her, muddled, and asked late for what. She reminded me the master had lifted my confinement the night before, and that I had academy today. I had burned through far too many brain cells and felt wrung out. Cecily dressed me in my academy uniform, wheeled the breakfast cart over, and by the time I had wolfed the food down, I was more or less back among the living. I gave her cheeks a couple of fond pinches, then headed down to the carriage bound for Brisley Royal Academy. The academy was exactly what its name promised. Everyone who studied there was rich or noble or both, and even the handful of commoner students each had some noble house backing them from the shadows. It was a truly aristocratic school, one of the oldest in the realm, founded at the Empire's very dawn. My carriage rolled behind unicorns bred in the elf forest. The gray lion blazoned on its side, and the lesser carriages slowed and yielded as it passed. A marquee house was not something a minor viscount or baron could afford to offend. At the gate, the coachman set down a small step, knocked, and announced we had arrived. I climbed out. The gate rose grand and solemn, boys and girls stepping down from gilded carriages all around, and for a moment I felt dropped back into my own student days. The grounds swallowed a full fifth of the royal capital, packed with lecture halls, libraries, a duel arena, and the magician's tower. I had barely started walking when a voice rang out. calling me a good-for-nothing scoundrel and demanding to know how I dared confess to Sophia. I turned and found Damon Mick, a Tier 1 intermediate warrior and Sophia's most rabid admirer. The Mick family had been close to the wards and intermarried with them for generations, and Damon was among the most gifted the Micks had, one of the few real candidates to win Sophia's hand. Being sneered at before I had finished my morning walk did not put me in a generous mood, so I gave him a raised middle finger, called him a shrimp dick, and turned my back on him toward the magician's tower. He clearly had no idea what the gesture meant, but he grasped it was nothing kind, and his face darkened. Then he drew his sword, leveled it at me, and challenged me to a duel in the name of a warrior. The word duel stopped me mid-step. It was a thing at once familiar and utterly foreign to the two lives stacked inside my head. Among nobles, a duel came in two flavors: the life and death duel and the duel of honor. In a life and death duel, the winner walked away and the loser did not, and it was called only when hatred could never be entangled any other way. A duel of honor spilled no blood. The victor claimed all the loser's honor and could demand anything of him, so long as it harmed neither his family nor the empire. The loser could not refuse, or the very god he had sworn upon would abandon him and freeze his strength for the rest of his life. Damon and I shared no such poisoned hatred, and the Mick family would never have allowed a death over a confession. What he was really calling for was a duel of honor, and he had simply left the word honor off the end. His shout pulled a ring of students in around us, all whispering. The consensus was easy to read: a delighted disbelief that Sophia's foremost suitor had run headlong into her scoundrel confessor, and a low, rising chant of the word duel that they ached to see. I was opening my mouth when a figure burst from the crowd and planted himself in front of me. He rounded on Damon and told him to take his problem up with him and keep his hands off his young master. The man was Blair Rivera, one of the commoner students the Gray family had recruited. Rain had once, without meaning to, saved Blair's mother's life, and ever since this gifted warrior had shadowed me everywhere. When I threw myself into a brawl, his was the first fist to land. The whole academy had a name for him: the scoundrel's vicious dog. He was a big, broad slab of a man, a top-tier warrior genius sitting only a rung below monsters like Sophia. And with the Gray family's resources, he had already reached high-tier first-rank warrior. Damon looked up at the wall of muscle blocking his way, and clearly felt the awkwardness, since he had been thrashed by Blair before. So he aimed his words past him at me, calling me a coward who did not dare climb onto the stage, saying it was me he wanted to duel and not my dog. I shoved at Blair's back and could not budge him an inch, so I gave up and walked out from behind him myself, waving off his low, worried murmur. As I stepped into the open, the crowd let out a little murmur over how good-looking I was. I gathered that was why the junior and senior girls still fancied the scoundrel despite his reputation. Under all those watching eyes, I peeled off my white left glove and flung it at Damon's feet, telling him that if he wanted a duel, he would have it. He could barely contain his glee since his provocation had landed exactly as he hoped. He tore off his own glove and threw it back, and the duel was sealed. I ignored Blair's frantic stare and told Damon I would see him at the duel arena tomorrow at noon, since the challenged party named the time and place. He sheathed his longsword, agreed, and turned to leave, and I gathered Blair up and set off for the magician's tower. The onlookers scattered to spread word of the coming bout. Even professors and teaching assistants caught the fever and began scrubbing the duel arena for the next day. Dean Cliff Ever had been catching up on sleep in his office when a burst of noise from the students below jolted him awake. He asked his secretary what the commotion was about. Jenny Haynes opened the door and reported that Damon meant to duel Rain, that Rain had agreed, and that the two had set it for the duel arena at noon the next day. Cliff perked up at once. "That brat Rain again," he said, actually accepting, and he decided there would be quite a show tomorrow. For all the trouble the boy caused, he added, it was a mercy he was around, since without him the academy would be a tomb. He did not think Rain irredeemable, since in his own youth he too had loved peeking at girls and picking fights. Just then a small white mouse scampered up onto his desk. Cliff scooped it up, held it to his ear, nodded along as it squeaked its report, and remarked that it was white lace today then. Jenny's face flamed red in an instant. She clamped her legs together, tugged her short skirt down, and glared at the lecherous old man and his lecherous mouse, then marched out and slammed the door. She swept down the corridor scarlet-faced and plainly livid. The students she passed traded knowing, helpless looks, murmuring that Miss Jenny had surely been spied on by the dean again, and that the man never did act his age. Blair fretted at my side on the road to the magician's tower, asking why I had agreed to duel Damon when I had not even reached the first rank. He had no idea what rank I actually held. I had picked up a spell called Silent Magic from that stack of books, and by burning a steady trickle of mana it hid my true cultivation. Short of some special detection art or an overwhelmingly higher rank, it never slipped. So I let the Silent Magic drop, and tapped Blair with a pulse of mana, and the high-tier first-rank warrior felt my rank at once. First rank primary magician. His thick brows shot up as he blurted that I had reached the first rank. And then, just as fast, his face fell. He pointed out that Damon, promotion or no, had been marinating at mid-tier first rank warrior a long while, and I knew the rest even unspoken. It came down to whether I could win. I clapped the big man on the arm and told him breezily to trust his young master, that tomorrow I would let him witness my true strength. There was nothing left for him to say, so he simply prayed for a miracle. He peeled off once we reached the tower, since he was no mage and had no classes there. Magical devices still shaped the empire deeply, so to lure what mages remained, the Empire had built the Magician's Tower almost obscenely lavish. It was raised entirely of dark blue marble, studded with magic crystals that threw off dazzling light. Inside, the great hall spread out in polished obsidian, an ancient magic core from centuries past floating and turning at its center. I climbed the spiral staircase, every step carved with fine old patterns, up to the third floor and let myself into a familiar research room. I pushed the door open and announced myself to old Jonah. Instructor Jonah Evans was bent over a huge work table, carving an intricate magic array, and he did not look up. He knew who it was, since I was the only person who ever walked in without knocking. I knew my mentor for the magic-obsessed man he was, so I did not disturb him. I dragged a stool over, sat beside the array he was cutting, and watched him work, his golden hair blazing almost white in the sunlight. Then, quite suddenly, he seemed to sense something. He stopped carving, turned, and fixed me with a stare, surprise plain in his eyes. I sat back, thrown, and asked why he was gaping at me instead of finishing his array. He dispersed the magic seal in his hand and asked, slowly, whether Lord Ford had finally found me a meditation technique that matched my talent. Since I had climbed to first-rank magician, I shook my head and reached for a lie on the spot, since the ancient book was the one thing I would never breathe a word of. I told him my father had found nothing, that I had bought the thing off a small market stall, and only lately realized it was a heritage stone. That was how I had come by the meditation technique. He nodded and told me I was extraordinarily lucky, that with a technique fitted to my gift, my 1 in a million talent would finally begin to show its teeth. Then he poured 2 cups of hot tea. He could feel the magic power in the room drifting toward me. He said, humming its little joys, because a full attribute talent was the darling of magic itself. He handed me a cup, and he was right. Ever since the heaven abyss, my power had crept upward, even when I was not meditating. He carried his own cup to the window, looked down at the students swarming under the tower, and asked whether something was happening today, since it was so lively. I sipped and told him it was probably my duel with Damon Mick, since I could not imagine what else there was to do here. At the name Mick, he seemed to turn something over behind his eyes, then let it pass, since he already knew about the business between Damon and Sophia. He asked whether Damon had challenged me over Sophia and whether I had truly agreed, noting that I did not look the least bit worried. I nodded that it was pretty much the shape of it, and asked why I should be worried when it was Damon who ought to be. That made him smile. He plainly admired the confidence and told me that confidence was the first ingredient of victory. Then he said we might as well begin the lesson. He took a white stone from a cabinet, set it between us, and began to lecture me on the uses and nature of the anti-magic stone. By then, most of the academy already knew about the duel, and the rumor mill had spun it well past the truth. Some swore that Rain and Sophia had secretly pledged themselves ages ago, and that her refusal had been nothing but a maiden shyness. Others wailed that the purest white flower of the Ward family had been plucked by that scoundrel, and begged him to leave a goddess or two for everyone else. A few enterprising students had even opened a betting pool, the odds running 15-1 against me. It was a steep line, but no one at the academy had ever seen me fight, and as far as they knew, I was a mere apprentice. All morning the place buzzed like a festival. At noon I walked out of the Magician's Tower. Magic was not a thing you learned by listening alone. The master leads you to the threshold, and the crossing is your own. Once Instructor Jonah had finished on the anti-magic stone and handed me a few spells of his own devising, he let me go. The gray carriage sat waiting at the gate, and the coachman hurried out a step for me to climb down onto. Once inside I asked Drake, the driver, whether anything fun was happening in the royal capital lately. He told me things had been quiet, though there would be an auction at the Anderson auction house in a week, with word of some fine goods coming up. I sat back with my legs crossed and let boredom settle over me. Magic was fascinating, but too much in one sitting wore a man down, and I found myself missing the old days of thumbing through videos of pretty women on a phone. Then I sat bolt upright, struck by a thought. Even if I could no longer watch such things on a screen, watching them in the flesh was surely the better deal. I wiped a bit of the delight from the corner of my mouth and put the thought away, since I had real business this afternoon. I told Drake to take me to the old antique ruins market that I was going to play, and he turned the carriage west. The point of the trip was simple. Every technique the ancient book would ever hand me, now and later, needed a clean story for where it came from. The old antique ruins market was a perfect laundering ground, since every year someone dug a rare art or spell or treasure out of its stalls. With the book's energy readouts guiding my eye, this whole wave of buried bargains was practically laid out for me to skim. The gray carriage rolling in set off an immediate stir. The crowd buzzed over the lion crest and wondered which great figure of the Grey House had lowered himself to a commoner's market. A few schemed to throw themselves forward and win the family's favor. Others hissed that the carriage surely held that short-tempered young master, and that offering yourself to him was as good as courting death. Drake set out his little step as ever, and the moment I climbed down and saw the crowd, I sighed inwardly. I had ridden the conspicuous carriage on purpose, so people would remember the gray heir had visited and could vouch for me later. But I had underestimated how the family name pulled at commoners, since even a known rascal was eyed with naked want. Drake stepped in front of me, drew his sword, and barked that 10 lives apiece would not pay for harming young Master Rain, then demanded to know where the market's managers were. Just as he finished, the market manager came sprinting up, breathless, begging my forgiveness and swearing he had run the whole way at the news. Drake glanced back, saw I looked calm, and ordered the man to scatter the crowd, warning that he would answer for it if any spy or assassin got near me. The manager bobbed his head and hurried off to call his guards. As it happened, there was no assassin in the throng, though the day could easily have gone another way. The crowd dispersed, and Drake stuck close and trailed me from stall to stall. I crouched in front of one and looked over the old man's jumble of wares, each wearing its own little energy count in my vision. Some were blank, some in the single digits, most of them feeble or dead. Only one small bead tucked in the far corner carried anything worth having, its reading sitting rich and heavy where the rest were empty, well into the hundreds. I picked it up and asked the owner his price. He took in my splendid clothes, the fierce guard at my back, and the steward throwing him urgent looks, and the tension jammed the answer in his throat until he stammered out, 1 silver coin. Before I could reach for the money, the steward lunged forward, seized the man by his rough shirt, and snarled at him. He called him Landon and demanded whether he had gone mad with greed, trying to cheat young Master Rain of a whole silver over a piece of junk. Landon went white, then caught himself. The young noble in front of him had to be someone of towering importance. For a steward, himself a noble, to fawn so hard. He backpedaled at once, claiming he had misremembered, that the bead was worth nothing, that I should just take it. I could only stare at the pair of them. In that moment, I finally understood how the old Rain had grown into such an arrogant tyrant. It was indulgence, all of it, everyone folding before he even pushed. So I stepped forward and kicked the steward flat, snapping that I had come to enjoy myself, not to bully people, and that his sort were the ones grinding my reputation into the dirt. He said nothing, picked himself up, rubbed his hands together, and gave me an oily, apologetic smile. I did not waste more breath on him. I took out a silver coin and pressed it into the owner's hand, and the man, still frightened, stole a nervous glance at the steward before he dared pocket it. I worked through a few more stalls and came away with a fair haul. I knew the pieces were only worth much at my current stage, but I let the book swallow them all, since I had no interest in puzzling out how each one worked. By the time it finished, the book's source energy had climbed past 1,000 points. The errand was done, so I told Drake to drive us home. At the Grey family manor beyond the royal city, I changed into house clothes under Cicely's hands and told her to bring me some of the maids with long legs. She blinked but nodded, and before long she had gathered 7 long-legged maids of various charms and led them in. They dipped into little bows and greeted the young master. I nodded and asked whether every one of them was of age, and they glanced at one another and nodded. The Empire counted 16 as adulthood, but the maids the Greys took on were generally 18 or older, bound by lifetime contracts, which pleased me enormously. All of them being grown women meant I could, in principle, make a move. With those faces and figures, the 7 would have walked runways back on Blue Star. I asked which of them could dance, and one stepped forward to say she managed a little, so I lounged back and told her to dance for me. She did, and I frowned. It was all too graceful, without a trace of allure, nothing that stirred a man. I pressed my lips together. I knew the sort of dancing I wanted, but no way to demonstrate it myself, unless I fancied stripping down before a room of maids. Then it struck me. I could hire someone to teach them. The Red Mill, the royal city's brothel, overflowed with tea-girls who knew exactly this art. The dancing maid, catching my frown, decided she had performed badly, stopped, and shrank back into the group. In the maid's eyes, I was still the violent young master who lashed out at the smallest provocation. Cecily had put in good words, but the fear held. All 7 stood with heads bowed, the one who had danced trembling. I clapped my hands and told them to lift their heads and look at me, promising that as long as they never crossed a real line, they had nothing to fear from my temper. Then I told them to relax and introduce themselves. They went down the line left to right, giving me their names, and once I had them, I told them to come and give the young master a massage, and sprawled across the wide bed. They slipped off their shoes and climbed up to work at me from every side, and the great bed filled with the faint scent of young women. Eve Richards took my left foot and Shirley Parker my right. Alice Make worked my left leg and Elaine George my right, while Ellie Hutchinson took my left arm and Rosie Seke my right. Emily Hunter cradled my head. Every one of them had a story I would come to know in time. Emily was the very maid who had danced for me, and I lay back against her lap and let the gentle hands of the rest draw a contented hum out of me. Meanwhile, Cecily sat nearby with a fruit platter, feeding me as I went. When she pressed a grape to my lips, I held it there, looked up at Emily, and tipped my head to tell her to take it. The maids all colored, and Emily most of all. They had noticed the young master was not the short-fused terror of before, and the way they looked at me had begun to shift. Emily lowered her head, blushing, took the grape from my mouth, and let me deepen the kiss a moment before we parted. I told her she was beautiful and reached for her, and she made a small sound of assent. The others slid off the bed to give us room, flushed and waiting. Just as I was about to go further, a knock landed on the door. I snatched the blanket up over Emily, and when Cicely moved to answer, I waved her off, saying I would see who was bold enough to spoil my fun. I straightened my clothes, hauled the door open, and found Jonas outside, his stern face alone enough to swallow my irritation. I asked Uncle Joe, a little helplessly, what it was. He told me the head of the family wanted to see me and had sent him to fetch me. I nodded, said I would be along, and shut the door. Back in the room, I told the 7 of them that they were all my personal maids now, freed from other duties. I would have Cecily inform Eve, and from tonight they would live with Cecily in the room beside mine. They nodded, everyone glad. A personal maid held a far higher station than an ordinary one and drew several times the wage, so even with my temper there had always been maids who hoped for the post. I went to Emily, kissed her cheek, and told her to get dressed, since my father wanted me and I did not know when I would be back. Then I leaned close to her ear and told her to come to my room that night. She flushed and answered softly that she would, and I opened the door and went with Jonas to see Ford. Jonas led me back to the same room where I had been dressed down before, my father still seated at the head of the table with a stern face. I asked whether he had called for me. He sipped his coffee, nodded, and said he had heard I meant to duel that Damon of the Mick family. I dropped into a nearby chair, put on a puzzled look, and asked whether it was worth policing a simple duel when I had caused no trouble. He answered that he had never said I caused trouble, that he was only confirming. I stretched and asked whether he had taken up meddling in young people's affairs now, and his face darkened. He told me a molten stone vein had recently been found straddling the border of the Grey and Mick territories, and that the two houses had never agreed how to split it. When he had gone to hash it out with Brant Mick that day, he happened to hear about my duel with Damon. Brant had proposed that the duel's outcome decide the vein, 60-40 in our favor if I won, and 40-60 against us if I lost. So he wanted my odds. If they were good, he would ride out and give Brant his answer that very night. I raised an eyebrow and thought a good while before telling him my odds had been about 90 in 100, but his news had shaken my certainty. I pointed out that family power was barred in an honor duel, and that we were bound to the Academy's own equipment, so there was no telling what tricks the Micks might reach for. My father nodded that it was good I could see that far. Damon had been a first-rank intermediate warrior for some time. He said and the Micks would certainly push him to first-rank advance tonight. Then he looked pained and admitted that if I were a warrior cultivating battle chi, forcing me up a rank overnight would not be impossible. But on the mage's road he was helpless. He told me only to do my best, and to lose like a man if I lost, since he had not yet given Brant his word. He spoke as though my defeat were already written, so I curled my lip and asked what I got if I won. He gave me a strange look. Since I turned 16 and took up magic, he had not once watched me fight in 2 years, so he had no idea what I could do. If I won gloriously and raised the Grey family's prestige, he said he would grant me one reasonable request, and if I won by trickery, he would simply add to my allowance. So I told him to remember he had said it, and that if I won, he was to tell Mother to give Eve to me. That struck him dumb. He had expected me to ask for a knight order or a warrior regiment, and here I was asking for a woman. Fine, he decided at last. If I won, I could have any household maid I liked, provided she consented, but I had to win cleanly and openly. The Lion's House did not stoop to winning like a rat. I agreed, then added that I wanted the magic-boosting treasures still sitting in the vault. He asked how many, and I told him the more the better. He eyed me with suspicion and asked whether I was trying to force my rank up, and I shook my head and said I had other uses for them. He did not press. Everyone was entitled to a secret. He told me that was fine, but he could not hand me everything. At first rank, I could take at most half of the first and second rank treasures, since the family needed its high-grade magic treasures to court mages. I agreed and left the room, and the treasures would follow to my chambers before long. Behind the closed door, my father and Jonas talked. Ford wondered aloud why the boy was so confident, whether he held some hidden card, and lit a cigar, gesturing an offer to the butler, who who declined. Jonas said he had never had much to do with mages, but that measuring himself, a first-rank assassin's attendant, against the young master, he had felt as though he were staring into something. Ford took a slow pull and asked what. Jonas said it was an abyss, a bottomless one. Ford went still, and the cigar burned slowly down between his fingers. I came back to my room, saw a pair of maid's shoes by the bed, and crossed a smile at the small shape huddled under the quilt, calling Emily's name. A little head of blue-white hair popped out of a gap like a mushroom through soil, her cheeks pinking as she breathed my title. I looked at the delicate beauty of her, kicked off my shoes and slid under the covers to where she lay half buried. My blood ran hot at the sight of her. Emily's figure was flawless, her legs above all, carved as though from white jade, the kind a man could happily lose a lifetime to. I reached for her, and the room filled with warmth and soft, private sound. I did not spare a glance for the servant who came halfway through to leave the treasures. By evening, I carried a spent Emily back to the room she now shared with Cecily and the other 6, and set the rest of my personal maids to cleaning my chambers. Then I had the servants bring in the treasures. Only the sleeping Emily and I were left. The magic crystal lamp glowed a soft milky white, the faint scent of Cecily still lingering, and I sat down on a blanket. To all appearances, I was tucking the treasures into my magic guide ring one by one, but in truth the book was devouring them. After it had swallowed better than 200 pieces, its source energy swelled to a figure that genuinely startled me, well past 8,000 points. I stood once the book had fed, stretching the numbness from my cross-legged legs. Then I looked at Emily's sleeping face and eased under the covers beside her. I held her soft and warm against me, and let my consciousness sink down into my spiritual world. I came before the book and had it lay out every spell I could currently exchange for. I went through them one at a time, turning the great pages deep into the night before I drew my mind back out. Emily slept beside me, and Cecily had crept under the quilt at some point too, and I gathered them both in and fell into a heavy sleep. When I woke the next morning, the two were already dressed. I pulled the sleep-tangled Cecily in for a firm kiss, and after a few token squirms she gave in, and I did not leave Emily out either. The 3 of us tangled a while before we finally rolled out of bed to wash. Then I took Emily and Cecily with me and boarded the carriage for the academy. The spells I had drawn from the book the night before left me very sure of myself. The carriage rolled along its usual road. Then the 3 of us caught a shout going up from a morning paper stand, a hawker crying the day's headline. Rain Gray of the Gray family and Damon of the Mick family were dueling for love. I cranked the window open and looked out at the crowd swarming the stand, baffled. It was only an honor duel, not a fight to the death, so I could not fathom the hype. The Empire saw better than a dozen honor duels a year, and this should have been nothing worth a headline. What I did not know was that the whole circus was the Mick family's doing. They meant to inflate Damon's name to its peak on the back of this duel. The moment he won, he could propose to Sophia, and if marriage was not possible, secure at least an engagement. I told Drake to buy me a copy. He pulled the carriage to a stop, hopped down, and made for the stand, where the crowd took one look at his fine livery and the gray crest, and parted to let him through. He bought the paper with ease and passed it up to me through the window before driving on. I opened it and read alongside Emily and Cecily. The paper heaped glory on Damon, his leading the night order against monsters near the capital, his training with common soldiers, all of it painting him the rare approachable noble. The account of me was less flattering. A catalogue of brawling with fellow nobles, spying on the Grand Princess at her bath, bullying commoners, and carrying on with a teaching assistant. Set side by side, the gulf between us was meant to be obvious at a glance. I read it and finally understood why the duel had stirred the city so thoroughly, since the Mick family was playing its games. Emily and Cecily knit their pretty brows over what the paper said about me, and one of them urged me to get down and make the stand's owner answer for slandering me. I folded the paper away and gathered a woman under each arm to soothe them. I told them to let people say whatever they liked, since I did not care a whit for my reputation, as long as they knew their young master was good. I added that the paper was not even wrong, since I was a scoundrel through and through. The truth was I had grown rather fond of the word. For one thing, it excused me from every tedious rule of noble etiquette. For another, since the world had already decided I was a scoundrel, it seemed only fair I got to be lecherous and high-handed to match. Drake set down the step and knocked to announce we had reached the academy. As the star of the day's duel, my carriage drew a great crowd of students and commoners the moment it pulled up. I stepped out first and handed Emily and Cecily down one at a time, and with an arm around each of their slender waists, I walked in under the weight of every stare. Behind me, the crowd finally dared to murmur over how stylish the young master was, forever flanked by beauties. Those gray maids, they whispered, were all my personal maids. With everything that implied, I brought Emily and Cecily into the magician's tower, and both stood stunned at its splendor. They gawked like curious infants, one marveling that this had to be the grandest magician's tower in the Empire, the other pointing at the ancient rotating cube of the magic core. The mages kept to their labs, so I let the two wander and stare. Then I led them up to my own room in the tower, where luxury announced itself in every corner. The floor was carpeted in the fur of a phantom-scent beast that breathed a faint, fresh smell of grass. Permanent magic crystal lamps blazed along the walls, and fine furniture stood between the machines for magic research. We left our shoes at the door, and I told the women to amuse themselves while I settled my state. They nodded and set off to whisper together. Cecily was quietly interrogating Emily about the shameful things she and I had gotten up to. Emily went scarlet, stole a glance at me where I sat meditating, then leaned in to murmur the details of the previous afternoon into her ear. The morning ran out and the sun climbed high. I took the two women, left the tower, and strolled toward the duel arena without sparing a thought for the eyes on us. Emily and Cecily had never set foot in the academy, so I gave them a proper unhurried tour of its sights along the way. I did not waste a single thought on Damon. The Academy's duel arena looked much like a soccer pitch from Blue Star, a raised platform at the center for the two combatants and tiered seating all around. Thanks to the Mick family's stoking, the commoners' hunger to watch ran so high that the Academy had been forced to throw part of the stands open to them. Up on the platform, Damon stood tall and proud, chin lifted, all of it so the goddess Sophia, watching from the side, might spare him a few more glances. As the minutes crawled by, the crowd's excitement sagged, and voices rose asking whether Rain had chickened out. Others scoffed that his father would beat him half to death for running, since losing on the stage was only a loss of face. Then a newly arrived student said he had seen me touring the grounds with two girls, to a chorus of disbelief that I was flirting with a duel about to start. The affair had swollen so large that it drew out idle great figures from the major houses. There sat the Academy Dean Cliff Ever, the Greyhead Ford, the Mickhead Brant, and the Wardhead Fabian Ward. Several dukes of the Ashton Royal line had come, and even mages from the tower who rarely emerged, all curious to see how the Academy's young mages had grown. From the stands, Brant drew impatiently on his cigar and needled Ford about when his boy was finally coming, and whether he had bolted. My father wore a dark, uncertain look, since with a son as unpredictable as me, it was entirely possible I might drop some enormous disaster on him. Rather than answer Brant, he leaned to Jonas and told him to go drag that bastard out of the Academy, because it was nearly past noon. Jonas had just nodded to go when the noise below the stands swelled, and someone shouted that Rain had come. Over on the east side, every head turned to find me arriving at the arena with my two women, looking every inch the lecherous playboy. I brought them to my guard Blair, gave a few instructions, and made ready to take the stage. I stepped slowly onto the arena, and the crowd's fever broke over its own crest. Cheer piling on cheer, nearly all of it for Damon. They urged him to crush the scoundrel who had defiled every goddess in the Academy, and reminded him that his goddess Sophia was watching. A few girls even shrieked that he was handsome, and they would marry him. Much of the noise came from Mick shills and commoners who had swallowed the story whole. The Greys had bought their own voices, but few believed them, so my support was quickly drowned. Damon watched me amble in on a yawn and jeered, tired from his long bake in the sun, asking why a coward like me had bothered to turn up at all. I looked him over where he stood roasting and told him it truly did fit to call him an idiot. I had set the duel for noon and never once said which part of noon. He drew himself up and called me crude, a boy without a shred of aristocratic manners, and a mouth full of filth who would surely be beaten today. I could not be bothered to answer, since nothing set my teeth on edge like people wielding etiquette as a bludgeon. As the two of us traded barbs, a teaching assistant arrived with a train of people carrying weapons and gear. He stepped between us and offered to hold our magic guide rings for safekeeping if we wished, though we were free to decline. He warned that drawing anything from a ring during the duel counted as an instant forfeit. Damon and I both shook our heads. He nodded, gestured to the racks of weapons and armor, and told us to choose our equipment. Before long, we had both picked our gear. Instructor Jonah, my mentor, took one look at what Damon had chosen, frowned, and asked the dean since when the Academy stocked anti-magic stone equipment, calling it grossly unfair to me. Jonah had studied anti-magic stone more deeply than anyone alive, so he was the first to feel something was wrong. The other mages caught the scent soon after and began to protest that anti-magic stone was punishingly restrictive to mages and the duel far too unfair, demanding the dean say something. The dean did not speak. He only turned a baffled look on his secretary, since he himself had no idea why anti-magic stone gear was in the Academy. Jenny flipped through the documents in her hands, went suddenly rigid, and whispered something into his ear that turned his face grim on the instant. Before the dean could get a word out, the Mickhead Brant spoke up, insisting this broke no rule. The rules allowed only weapons and gear already present within the Academy, he said, and the Academy plainly now had anti-magic stone equipment, so why should Damon not use it? The dean frowned and told the assembled mages what he had learned only moments ago. The The Academy had, the previous night, been gifted a batch of gear laced with anti-magic stone powder. The donor, he said, turning his eyes on the man who had just spoken, was the head of the Mick family. The dean was plainly revolted by the maneuver, the older generation reaching down to rig the duel of the young. He looked as though he had wasted all his years on this earth to be standing here watching it. My father shot to his feet and smashed his chair to splinters, roaring at Brant whether he had a death wish, whether he spent every waking day turning his schemes on his own people. He let his full aura loose and fixed Brant with a stare that promised a fight to the finish if no clean answer came. He could stomach me losing for lack of strength, but never a loss engineered by another man's plotting. Under the weight of my father, the dean, and a crowd of mages, the Mick head felt a thread of cold sweat bead at his brow. For all that he was a 5th-rank warrior, he forced himself to answer that he had broken no rule. The Mick family had indeed gifted the Academy anti-magic stone gear, he said, and he demanded to know which law forbade a house from making the Academy a gift. And since the Academy now owned it, why could Damon not use it? That left the whole gathering with nothing to say. The Empire's laws around mages had never been thorough, and this time Brant had genuinely found a loophole. My father was on the verge of stepping down and driving his fist through Brant's face when Jonas caught him. The shockwave the two of them threw off snapped every eye toward them, and for the first time the crowd realized the butler at Ford's side was himself of the 6th rank. The Grey family had been hiding its true depth all along. Jonas leaned in and murmured something at my father's ear, and only then did Ford shoot Brant one last murderous glare, snort heavily, and sit back down. The dean pulled his gaze off Brant as well, his good humor gone in an instant. The knot of mages regarded the Mick head with grim faces, privately resolving never again to sell a magic item or a guide ring to the Mick family. Brant only told himself he had made a fair few enemies today, then shrugged it off, since it was all in service of Damon's momentum, and gains and losses came together. Up on the platform, Damon had strapped himself into the full set: anti-magic stone armor, anti-magic stone longsword, anti-magic stone round shield, while I had chosen nothing but mage robes made to amplify a spell's power. He knew exactly what he wore and looked insufferably smug, telling me again I would be defeated, and I only curled my lip and called him an idiot. Seeing us both changed, the assistant handed each of us a jade token, meant to safeguard our lives in case a blow ran past what we could pull back. Then he told us to set a distance of 100 paces. Damon and I each stepped back, and as the gap widened, the arena fell abruptly silent. Then the assistant raised a magical device and loosed a beam of light into the sky, where a brilliant firework bloomed and burst. The duel had begun. Damon drove the force down through his feet and launched himself at me, cracks splintering across the platform where he pushed off, and came on at a savage speed behind his raised shield. The 100 paces between us vanished in a blink. As he bore down unstoppable, a hissing bolt of lightning gathered into my hand, and I flung the thunder spear at him with everything I had. It crossed the gap in an instant and struck his shield full on. In that same instant, the shield swallowed it whole, the spear bursting apart into scattered shards that left long black scorch marks. Then Damon was on me, his long sword sweeping around in a guard's cross slash, and I threw up a barrier spell, a faint blue wall that caught the slash cold. I stamped my foot and loosed an earth tremor, and as the magic broke free, the ground bucked and heaved under Damon and tore his footing out from under him. I fell back fast to open distance again. That thunder spear had left me genuinely uneasy. Lightning was among the deadliest kinds of magic there was, so how had his shield not taken so much as a single mark? Some kind of insulation, maybe. Damon sneered as though he could feel my confusion, and told me he had warned me I would be defeated today. This gear of his had been steeped in anti-magic stone powder, its resistance to magic a terrifying thing. So how could I ever hope to win against him? A thread of pink light closed the cut on my cheek as water healing wiped away the last of the blood Damon had drawn. His explanation earlier had settled one question in my head, and of course it raised a fresh one. Anti-magic stones cost a fortune. So how did a school like this end up with whole crates of the gear? I already knew the answer. The Mick family's fingerprints were all over it, and that told me exactly how badly they wanted me broken. The stands were still roaring Damon's name, and something a little unhinged lit up in my chest. Mages had stayed silent for far too long in this world. It was time somebody reminded this crowd what a real mage looked like when the magic came down on their heads. Damon watched me with that cat-and-mouse smile, certain he had already won. I let it slide right off me. A faint light gathered over my skin and gilded my mage robe in gold until the whole thing looked noble and divine, and then my feet left the ground. I rose over the arena, looked down at that sea of faces, and let a slightly mad grin spread across my mouth. Yesterday I had poured every last point of source energy into a long-lost secret technique, and today it would finally earn its keep. Instant casting. The moment I triggered it, countless magic arrays bloomed across my vision, and my eyes seemed to sink into something deeper than plain sight. I lifted my right hand, and above the platform a forest of phantom spears took shape, each one woven from pure light and breathing a cold edge that made the skin crawl. As the spears formed, the light pouring off them flared like a field of small suns, and the whole jewel arena went white. The glare was so fierce the audience could not keep their eyes open, tears pricking at them like needles. The arena was forced to raise its barrier so everyone could watch the duel through it. Hundreds of light spears hung over the platform like blades built for judgment, and I looked at Damon behind his shield and let my smile turn wild. In one breath, the whole situation flipped, and the crowd that had chanted for Damon fell dead silent. This was nothing like the mages in their books, the ones who wilted after 2 or 3 spells. Even the big shots up in the seats straightened a little. Most of them were warriors and knights who understood none of my methods, and even so, the sheer scale of it rattled them. The mages in the crowd, though, lost their minds. One shrieked about instant casting and demanded to know whether his eyes were lying. A second old man howled that he would take me as his closed-door disciple and marry his only granddaughter to me on the spot. Up in the stands, the dean and my instructor Jonah Evans traded a long look, and each saw the same storm churning in the other. Cliff walked over and asked Jonah flatly whether he had taught me this. Jonah shook his head, honestly baffled. He admitted that in all these years he had only ever taught me theory, and that he could not do what I was doing, so there was no way he had passed it on. He called me not only gifted but absurdly lucky to have stumbled onto instant casting, and his eyes burned with plain envy. Cliff added that condensing this many spears as a mere Tier 1 mage meant my magic capacity ran more than 10 times what it should. He said the most staggering thing was not even that. Jonah finished the thought for him and named my magic recovery speed. As a mage with talent in every attribute, I refused no kind of power, and Jonah swore he could feel the mana across the whole arena bending toward me to top me back up. Then my father shoved his way in and asked whether his son could win, leaning on the word son like it was made of gold. Cliff and Jonah both rolled their eyes, silently wondering why Ford was not calling me a scoundrel now. Jonah told him that between my levitation and that monstrous recovery speed, I was already untouchable. Ford's eyes went wide. This brat really had cards up his sleeve. He had come here planning how to comfort me after the loss, and now he was scrambling to work out how to help me win Eve instead. The whole spectacle had the mages buzzing and my father glowing, but Brant Nick sat there with his jaw clenched tight. My father drifted over and asked with a sarcastic lilt why he was not celebrating, since Damon was about to lose. Brant drew a slow breath and demanded to know how his boy could possibly lose to a handful of little light spears. Ford only told him he was as stubborn as a dead duck, and promised to see how calm he stayed once Damon went down. Down in the arena, my raised hand fell. I told Damon to dance for me. The spears poured loose one after another and rained straight at him. Each one struck with a heavy crack, and hundreds of them screamed in from every angle. Damon was a high-level first-rank warrior with real skill, so he threw himself into dodging and weaving through the storm. There were simply too many to slip past. Every block landed like a siege crossbow bolt hammering into him, and even the ones he deflected punched holes in the ground before fading. Damon watched his attackers thin out and started to laugh, telling me the move looked terrifying but amounted to nothing. His words died in his throat because I waved my hand and filled the sky with hundreds of thunderbolts crackling with live current. The air over the arena turned overcast, as though a downpour were minutes away, and then the thunder came roaring down. Before Damon could catch a single breath, I sent fire swords and water spears at him in wave after wave, one element crashing behind the last. For a moment he must have felt like he was fighting all of nature. The whole world turned against him. Every mouth in the audience hung open, and even Sophia Ward, watching from the sidelines, felt the pressure settle on her chest. So this was what a mage truly was. The academy students had gone quiet, and slowly a few of them found their voices. One kept asking whether this was really the playboy everyone called a loser, because if I was a loser, what did that make him? Another marveled that I had studied magic for 2 years without ever showing my hand. A cluster of girls simply screamed that young Master Rain was the most handsome man alive. In the face of raw strength, the crowd had decided my worst habits were just the quirks of a genius. One girl even told her friends I had once glimpsed her bathing and wanted her father to settle a marriage. I looked down at Damon and told him he was truly unfortunate. My teacher had lectured me about anti-magic stones only the day before, and here Damon had brought that very thing to face me. It was like lighting a lantern in a latrine and calling it a plan. I explained that anti-magic stones did restrain mages, but every stone had a ceiling on how much magic it could drink. Feed it past that limit, and the stone stopped being anti-magic at all. The instant I finished, the left pauldron of Damon's armor gave out under the endless barrage and shattered. Panic swallowed him whole. He screamed that it was impossible, that no one had this much magic, that it went against everything the book said. Then he demanded to know whether I had swallowed some forbidden drug before the duel. I told him that books were books, and I was me. I crossed my arms high above him and looked down at his madness. I, Rain, a mage with talent in every attribute born into this age of Dharma decline, would drag magic back to the summit of the world. The dark clouds over the arena began to thin, and out of that dissolving murk a vast, magnificent blade slowly took form, the Damocles sword. It hung in the sky like a guillotine, so enormous it rivaled more than half the platform. Its point aimed straight down at Damon. Under my will, the Damocles sword began to shrink, drifting lazily toward me until it settled over my open palm. The mages in the stands had gone speechless. The Damocles sword was the strongest Tier 1 magic recorded anywhere in the Magician's Tower, capable of gravely wounding a Tier 2 mage. Its one flaw was appetite. Casting it usually drained a Tier 1 mage of every drop of magic and a share of his life force, which was why they named it solo combat magic. The mages could hardly believe a beginner had managed it, let alone that he was shrinking the sword to pack its power tighter. My father looked at the blade balanced on my palm and asked, half to himself, whether this was really his son. Brant gripped his fists white, because the moment that sword appeared he understood Damon had already lost. The blade over my hand was not even half the size of Damon's longsword, yet the force inside it made him feel like he faced a savage beast. Condensing the Damocles sword had drained me, and my face had gone pale. I had only managed it because the Heaven Abyss meditation kept refilling my mana at a monstrous rate. Even so, the sword gnawed at my spirit as much as my magic, and the dark gold shimmer wrapped around me dimmed to shade. Still, it was more than enough. I told Damon it was over, and turned the blade on him, and the Damocles sword drifted almost lazily down toward his position. The sight of it froze Damon like prey under the gaze of a primordial beast, and his body simply refused to obey. He screamed at himself to move, calling himself the pride of the Mick family, ordering his legs to work for the family and for Sophia. Somehow he moved. Damon unleashed a full-power strike straight into the descending blade. His bloody sunset, a longsword flushed the color of fresh gore. The two edges met, and the Damocles sword devoured his blade in an instant, and swung its point toward him. Right as it grazed him, his jade token cracked and teleported him clear of the arena. The sword slammed into the platform with a sound like the sky splitting. The blast lit up white as a second sun. Half the arena caved in under the sword's weight, leaving a deep crater, and the barrier itself shuddered. That was a barrier built to hold against Tier 4 attacks. As the Damocles sword faded and Damon vanished off the field, every eye locked onto that enormous scar in the stone. Then the silent arena detonated into cheers, my name breaking across the stands over and over. The duel was done, and as I drifted back to Earth, I seemed to become a different man. Gone was the calm control. I swayed along with the crowd and howled for them to give me more. The big shots in the seats watched a noble with no manners left in him, and could only shake their heads. I was still the same Rain I had always been. From today on, though, not a single soul would ever call me a waste again. Sophia watched me strut and drink in the noise, her eyes a tangle of feelings, before she quietly slipped away. My sudden rise had planted a real crisis in the Empire's own genius. Even for that final Damocles sword, she was not confident she could have taken it head-on and lived. She needed to go train, and she needed to do it now. Damon had been dumped into a lounge, and he crouched on the floor with despair sitting heavy in his eyes. His father found him there and asked whether one loss was enough to make him retreat. Damon looked up and said the family had prepared so much for him and he had lost anyway, that he was a waste, and tears welled in his stubborn eyes. Brant squatted down and set a hand on his shoulder. Brant asked who had never failed, and swore that even he had failed countless times when he was young. Failure itself was never the terror, he said. The terror was letting a single loss make you afraid of losing again. They had all misjudged me and buried the truth of my strength too deep to read. So he told his son not to sink into it. Losing this once did not mean losing next time, and what Damon needed now was to study the defeat and make me stumble twice as hard later. His father's words put the fire back in Damon. He wiped his face and swore he would not disappoint him. Then he stood, walked back into the arena, and approached me where I was still riding the crowd's noise. He told me he had lost, and that by the rules of the duel I could demand one thing of him that did not harm the family, or the Empire. He said to name it, and swore that however I chose to humiliate him, he would accept it. I stopped cheering and looked at the grim resolve on his face, and the whole arena went hushed. The truth was, I did not hate Damon all that much. His mockery had been the hot blood of a young man, and who would not lose his temper watching his goddess get chased by a so-called scoundrel? I certainly would have. Still, wrong was wrong, and right about then all my worst instincts came bubbling up. I stepped close and murmured into his ear that I would not humiliate him, but he would still answer for every insult. Within 2 days, he was to steal the underwear Sophia was wearing today. Then, for the next full month, he would report the color of her underwear to me every single day. Damon's whole body locked up, and he stumbled back with his eyes stretched wider than during the duel. He could not have heard that right. Steal Goddess Sophia's underwear? He stared at my grinning face like a man watching a demon, swallowed hard, and asked whether I had misspoken. I laughed low and told him he had heard every word, and asked whether he wanted me to repeat it in front of everyone. If a certain person ever found out, his task would jump straight to hell mode. He waved both hands and begged me not to. I ignored him and walked off laughing toward Emily and Cecily in the stands, slung an arm around each of them, and strolled out under a wall of admiring stares. Damon drifted back to his father in a daze. Brant told him to keep his head up, that it was only a bit of humiliation, and everyone got humiliated sooner or later. Damon opened his mouth and found no words would come. His father frowned and asked whether he was hiding something. Damon glanced around, made sure no one was near, and finally forced out what I had demanded, his face going redder with every word until it looked roasted. Brant could not believe it either. No cruel insult, nothing genuinely shameful, just the theft of a girl's underwear. For any of his other children, this would have been nothing. But to Damon, she was sacred and untouchable. To keep himself worthy of marrying her, he had never even taken a personal maid, terrified her opinion of him would sour. My little forfeit had jammed Damon between the god of warriors and his goddess. Brant sighed and told him the family would handle the theft. I was about to leave with my two admirers when my father, the dean, and a whole crowd of mages caught up and blocked my path. Emily and Cicely dropped to one knee the instant they saw the Grey Patriarch, and Ford waved them back up. I looked at the parade of big shots trailing my father and asked him what all these mages were doing here. Ford clapped my shoulder with open pride and told me they had come for me. I had hidden my strength well, he said, and finally shown the world the prestige of the Grey family. He barely got the words out before the mages surged forward and swallowed me in a ring, elbowing my father clean out of the circle. They came at me one after another. One named himself Theo Smith, a Tier 4 lightning mage, and swore that under him I would learn every scrap of his lightning destruction magic. Another scoffed at lightning and named himself Leon Burton, a Tier 4 archmage with talent in fire, water, and wood, promising me all the magic devices I could ever want. None of it moved me. I had the ancient book, and with enough source energy there was no magic on the continent I could not simply take for myself. What tempted me were the things the book could never produce on its own, the magic devices and the magic scrolls. Then old Terry shoved a portrait at me, asked whether his granddaughter was not pretty, and offered to send her to my bed that night if I studied under him. I looked at the little beauty in the picture and let genuine consideration show. That was all it took to send the mages into a frenzy. One cursed Terry as an old pervert, even while every last one of them was clearly running through which pretty granddaughters they had waiting at home. Dean Cliff cut through the mob with his secretary Jenny Haynes at his side, reminding them all that I already had a teacher. The mages muttered that an instructor was not a real master. Jonah Evans smiled and said he knew exactly what they were thinking. With my all-attribute talent, a single teacher would only ever leave most of my elements neglected. So why not all teach me together, each covering the field he knew best? By the time they finished happily agreeing, they turned around and realized the guest of honor had wandered off. They found me a short distance away, leaning practically against Jenny and chatting her up, and she was clearly charmed. My father hauled me back with a shout. A whole cohort of masters was arranging my education, he grumbled, and here I stood picking up girls, and a woman would be the death of me one day. I curled my lip and shuffled back to his side. Jonah explained that since my talent had regained its shine, the teachers all wanted to instruct me, and hoped to do it together as a group. I looked at their eager faces and told them of course I agreed, and they lit up at once. Then I added a small however, and the whole group tensed right back up as I asked, ever so respectfully, about my apprenticeship gifts. A wave of relief rolled through them once they realized it was only that. My father's palm cracked across the back of my head hard enough to make me stagger. How did a brat with this many teachers still have the nerve to shake them down for gifts? He was winding up for a second slap when he suddenly froze, because a ring of very unfriendly eyes had settled on him. The mages glared with real danger. As my masters they now counted as half my father's, and laying hands on their freshly acquired disciple meant he had already stepped onto the road of death. I read the room, rolled my eyes, and flung myself into the arms of the elderly grandmother among them, whimpering about my poor aching head. Granny Keeley took one look at the teary boy in her embrace, and clearly saw her own late grandson in me. She cradled the back of my head and rubbed it, and the longer she rubbed, the fiercer her glare at my father grew. Ford's scalp prickled with dread. Granny Keeley was a terrifying poison mage who had made her name across the Empire in her youth, a woman they called the Voodoo Witch. She was a Tier 4 mage who had spent an entire lifetime on the path of poison, and my father very much did not want to spend his days paralyzed. He looked at me tucked safe in her arms, and pasted on the most insincere smile I have ever seen, announcing that something urgent had come up at home. His eyes promised me we would talk once I got home. He trotted off toward the academy gate, and Instructor Jonah dipped his head to the group and slipped out after him. The moment my father was gone, The mages' faces bloomed into pure delight, and they began stuffing gifts into my pockets. They were overjoyed to have found an heir for the magic they had bled their whole lives into. Out came rare spellbooks, rare treasures, and magic devices of every kind, handed over like they cost nothing. I warmed to the old crowd fast, this pack of nearly 100-year-old scholars, and was soon calling them Grandpa and Grandma and Uncle and Aunt. They told me to come to the Magician's Tower the next morning for a special curriculum, and I left with Emily and Cecily while they watched my back until I was out of sight. Drake drove the carriage and had the three of us back at the villa in no time. Upstairs, I started going through my new haul. First came the high-grade healing potions, dozens of them potent even for a man at my father's level. Then came a dazzling spread of magic-boosting treasures like Selena Stone and Phantom Color Feather and Storm Sapphire. I did not recognize all of them, but the ancient book's appraisal never rated a single one below 500 points of source energy. The rest were devices, staves, and mage robes. My favorite by far was a Tier 5 spatial device from Leon. Its interior several times larger than the one I already wore, larger even than my father's. I wondered whether to feed it all to the ancient book or keep it for myself, then told Emily to fetch Boao, the man who ran our warehouse. Boao came in and his eyes nearly fell out of his head. He gasped over a slab of shark amber stone, demanding to know who had left a piece this size on the carpet like a waste of heaven's own gifts. Then he found holy fire grass, a treasure said to awaken fire talent in an ordinary person. The old warehouse keeper knew his trade cold, walking me through the use and origin of every piece, and when he finally left, he dragged his feet at the door. I set aside the treasures with special effects and let the ancient book devour the rest, the ones that only raised raw magic power. As the last treasure dissolved into it, the book's source energy readout climbed by nearly 10,000 at once. Added to what I already held, my total finally broke past 10,000 points. Not bad for an afternoon's begging. A muffled knock came against the solid wood door. Cecily, who had been curled in my lap a moment before, hurried up, smoothed her clothes, and went to answer it. The one waiting outside was the head butler Jonas, as neat and humble as ever, and he said the master was calling for me. Cecily turned to relay it, but I was already at the door, since I had heard the whole thing. I told Jonas to lead on and called him Uncle Joe. He walked ahead and I trailed behind, down a corridor packed with priceless potted plants and paintings, maids and servants bowing as we passed. Jonas remarked that my performance today had been outstanding, and that the master had not been this happy in a long time. I told him it was nothing, just a little modesty, while my eyes tracked the figure of every maid we passed. He chuckled, and soon we reached my father's office. I pushed the door open and walked straight into Ford and my mother Lila, being sickeningly affectionate. Seeing me, my father coughed and reined himself in, then poured a cup of tea for my mother before turning to me. He told me I had grown clever enough to trick my own old man, and that if he had not run fast, he would have caught at least 3 kinds of poison off that grandmother. His words were all complaint, but his face was practically glowing. I dragged a chair over and sat, asking who told him to forbid me from accepting apprenticeship gifts, since it was only proper for a teacher to welcome a new student. He curled his lip. Plainly, he thought I got to accept the gifts while he returned them, though I had shown real gray momentum today, so he let me keep the lot as a reward. I cleared my throat and asked my father, with a pointed glance at my mother, about the thing we had agreed on. Ford raised his brows in feigned confusion and wondered aloud what we could possibly have agreed on. My eyes shot wide. Old Deng was trying to weasel out of his word. He kept sipping his tea, the picture of composure, sighing about how fragrant it was. I narrowed my eyes and made a private vow to leave the old man a very large surprise tomorrow. My mother laughed at the pair of us and said Ford had already told her everything. I was grown now, she said, and there were things I ought to know. She had watched Eve grow up since she was small and trusted her completely, so from now on Eve would follow me. I went straight to my dear mother's side, snatched the teapot from Ford, and eagerly filled her cup, telling her she was the best and that I loved her most of all. She patted my head, her eyes soft. My father cleared his throat and pointed at his own empty cup, so I poured for him too, since old Deng had kept his word after all. Neither of them asked where I had gotten my meditation technique, because everyone was entitled to a few secrets. With the matter settled, my father waved me off so he could get back to doting on my mother. Back in my room, I found Eve chatting with Emily and Cecily, and all three came forward with a soft chorus of young master. I looked at Eve, and her face flushed as she immediately started to undress. I stopped her fast and asked what she thought she was doing, and whether I really looked that desperate. Emily and Cecily wore very awkward expressions, and I put it together at once. Emily must have told Eve about what happened that day. I flicked Emily's forehead as a small punishment, then let my face turn serious. I told Eve that I did like her body, but I had not asked my mother for her just to keep a pretty vase around. I wanted her to run my affairs, my schedule, and the other personal maids, exactly the way Uncle Jonas ran things for my father. Then I asked whether she was truly willing to follow me. Eve dropped to one knee at once and swore she was, promising she would never fail my expectations, and the way she addressed me had already changed. I told her to get up and asked whether she trained in battle chi. She said she did, though her talent was poor and she stood only at second-rank intermediate assassin. I asked her age, and she said she was 22. I closed my eyes. The three of them went quiet and simply waited, not daring to disturb me while I withdrew into my mental world. After a while, I opened my eyes, and an inheritance jade stone had appeared in my hand. I told Eve that since she was mine now, the 10 Directions 1,000 Shadows breathing method was hers. It was a super-rank assassin's art, nearly the equal of the Grey family's own fearless lion breathing method. She accepted it with grave care. I told her to learn it right there, and she sat cross-legged on the fur rug, pressed the jade stone to her forehead, and sank into the art within. I signaled Emily and Cicely to keep silent, and Cicely eased the door open and stood watch outside. To pass the time, I took out a book called Travels and Observations of the Soltis Continent, which laid out the legends and histories of the nations across this world. None of it lived in my predecessor's memories, so I had to learn it the slow way. For a while, the only sound in the room was the rustle of turning pages. Before long, the jade stone on Eve's forehead dimmed and went dark. It was done. Eve opened her eyes, astonished that this art truly ranked alongside the family's precious fearless lion-breathing method. I asked whether she had learned it, and she confirmed she had, though she wondered whether the rank was not too high for her. I only rolled my eyes and said nothing since I was grooming her as a genuine confidant. I told her to show me what the art could do. She asked me to turn off the lights first, and I did. The instant the room went dark, Eve's figure simply vanished, and no matter how I stretched my senses, I could not find her. Only by pulling on the surrounding mana through the abyss was I finally able to feel where she stood. That stealth alone made the whole trade worth it. Then several shadows rose in front of me and knelt on one knee. Eve explained that the art let her create and command shadows in the dark, and that at the 4th rank she could even seize an enemy's own shadow for an assassination. Its cultivation speed was extraordinary, she added, and she swore she could reach 4th rank assassin within a single year. I nodded, satisfied. The art had its limits in bright places, but in the dark it was genuinely terrifying. Emily stood off to the side, dumbstruck by the whole display. I told her it was getting late and to go rest. My voice snapped her out of it, and she fidgeted with the hem of her skirt and asked whether I did not need her company tonight. I scooped up Eve and told her tomorrow could be her turn, since Eve would be keeping me company tonight. Emily pouted and wished me good night, and I carried the blushing Eve toward the wide bed. The moonlight that night was uncommonly lovely. I woke early the next morning with my beauty already gone from beside me. The moment I lifted the golden silk quilt, Eve came in leading several personal maids, her timing flawless, and they set about dressing me in my academy uniform while Cicely wheeled in the breakfast cart. Eve reported that my morning belonged to the Magician's Tower and the Mages, and that my afternoon belonged to my fiancée, Miss Adele, who was coming to visit. Uncle Jonas had left word that I should take leave if I had an afternoon class, and come home early if I did not. With Cicely and Alice serving on either side, I worked my way through a lavish breakfast. Alice wiped a crumb from my mouth with a white silk handkerchief, and I nodded to Eve to say I understood the plan. Then I pulled Alice into a quick kiss that left her flushed, pinched her cheek, and headed downstairs with Eve. On the stairs, I mentioned that Drake had told me about some auction this week, something starting with Anne. Eve supplied the name, the Anderson auction. I told her to clear my whole schedule for the day of it, because I wanted to go and enjoy myself. She smiled and said she would mark it down. The auction was 5 days out, she added, and the invitation had reached the family head a month ago, so I only had to ask my father about it. I gave her a parting kiss and took the carriage to the academy. On the road, we passed a newspaper stall in an uproar, the vendors shouting about the fame-making duel of the Empire's genius mage young Master Rain, first come, first served. People were asking whether it meant that Rain from the Grey family, the one who had crushed the long-famous Damon Mick. Drake straightened his back with pride as the crowd spotted the gray carriage and turned to stare, and he drove us clear of them, and up to the academy gate. I stepped down into a wall of stairs heavy with awe and envy, because the Rain standing here was no longer the waste of the old days. On the strength of that Damocles sword, my combat rating had climbed close to Sophia's, the most gifted warrior in years. I straightened my collar and walked toward the Magician's Tower through the reverent gaze. They say fame brings its own trouble. My looks had always been good, and now that my reputation had turned, pretty juniors and seniors kept darting up to press love letters into my hands. I refused none of them, and each smile I gave only turned their faces redder. It had the male students grinding their teeth, already drafting the charter for an anti-Rain alliance. Dean Cliff was already waiting at the Magician's Tower, rocking in a chair by the gate, the only person alive lazy enough to lounge like that outside so solemn a place. He rose and handed me a sheet of gold-edged paper. my curriculum for the semester. It looked much like a college schedule, except lessons only ran in the mornings and left every afternoon free. The teacher listed for today was the dean himself, and I raised an eyebrow. I asked whether the dean would truly be teaching me in person. Cliff was the highest-ranked mage in the Empire, a Tier 6 mage on level with my father, with talent in space, water, wood, and healing, and space magic his specialty. He confirmed it. That line I had thrown out during the duel, about letting magic return to the peak of the world, had struck straight at his heart and reminded him of his disciple. It had even made him consider taking a new one. I was puzzled since I had never once heard of the dean having a disciple. He nodded and told me he had taken one when he was young, but the young man had died in a power struggle. I offered my condolences. He waved it off, saying it had happened many years ago before he served the Empire, which was why I had never known. I asked what he meant to teach me today. He only smiled, waved a hand, and a magic array bloomed on the spot, and the two of us stood at once atop the tower in his research room. The place was plain, with none of the elaborate devices I expected, just thick books everywhere. He asked with heavy pride how I liked his space magic and whether I wanted to learn it. I was lucky, he told me. With a technique like instant casting in hand, if I could master teleportation, then short of a treasure built to seal space, I would struggle to die even if I tried. Then he floated every scattered book back onto its shelf. The word space magic lit real hunger in my eyes. In this age of end magic, magic books of any kind had grown scarce, and a rare discipline like space magic was rarer still. Even in the ancient book, its price ran many times higher than magic of the same tier, so learning it straight from the dean was the best deal I could ask for. I told him I had wanted his space magic for ages, but my old man kept whining that I had not even reached tier 1. Once the room was tidy, the dean's gaze went a little unfocused, and he asked me, almost shyly, how exactly I had come by that instant casting technique. I gave him a smooth lie. I said I had bought a lot of jade tablets out at the old antique ruins market. One of them had somehow regained its luster when I triggered something I did not understand, and that was when I realized it was an inheritance jade stone for instant casting. He sighed at that, because an inheritance jade stone was a one-time thing. He nodded, said it seemed he had no fate with it, and admitted he had half hoped Ford had gotten his hands on some book of secret magic. Then he built a pale blue array in the air and walked me through every key point of its construction. With the epiphany the ancient book gave me, my speed of learning left that nearly 100-year-old man stunned, only deepening his conviction that I could truly carry magic forward. The morning slid by under his instruction, and by the time I came out of it I had mastered teleportation and a space spell of his own invention, one he called Space Blade. The dean looked worn out, and I stepped over to pour him a cup of tea. The tea had gone cold, but he tipped it back in one swallow with admiration all over his face. He told me to stop for the day and practice both space spells more at home, so I could learn to cast them insta. Then he caught himself and remembered I already had instant casting, and laughed at his own aging, muddled head. Even so, more practice would deepen my feel for spatial mana, a hidden benefit that could surface in the right environment. I told the dean I would head home, set down the teapot, and left. Watching me go, he lowered his head and murmured that he would need to make a trip to the Magic Association for my sake, a hint of old memory surfacing in his eyes. The moment I stepped out of the research room, a crowd of mages had gathered at the door, waiting for me. One demanded to know where I was eating lunch, and insisted I come to his place, since he had heard I loved Azure lobster tails best. Another jumped in, offering to have his granddaughter feed me the lobster by hand, and the first old man asked whether he was begging for a beating. I grinned at the squabble. Their kindness had a motive, but a good one, since every one of them hoped I would carry on the magic they had chased their whole lives. For an orphan out of Blue Star in another life, all that fussing warmth was something I had never felt before. I thanked them and begged off, explaining that my fiancé was coming and I had to be home, and promising to visit each of them next time. They nodded, disappointed but understanding, and I said goodbye one by one, before taking the magic stairs down. Lunch back at the Grey Villa was windcrest steak with pale green citrus, steamed crystal shrimp, and the roasted hind leg of a magic horned leopard. The silver knife and fork gleamed under the crystal chandelier, while Eve tucked a napkin at my collar. My father told me to go tidy up after I finished, since my mother had prepared a formal outfit for me to meet Adele in. I nodded through a mouthful of mansai fruit, finished it, clapped my hands clean, and took Eve upstairs. I washed up with Eve and the maids attending me. When I came out with dripping hair, a wave of my hand wrapped it in a stream of air and dried it in moments. The maids changed me into a gorgeous set of clothes. My parents had laid out a full suit of Viscount noble attire, but the second I saw it, I frowned, and I made Eve swap it for the kind of thing I usually wore instead. Soon, the Hill family's procession rolled up to the estate. Charlie Hill stepped down from the lead carriage in full ceremonial dress and gave my father a knight's salute, greeting the Marquis Grey, the Madam, and me with careful courtesy. The Hills were a rising Viscount house, and against the old marquee line of the Greys they sat like a single star beside the bright moon, which was why Charlie was so deferential. My father smiled and told Charlie there was no need for such formality, that they were hardly strangers, since Charlie had once been the 5th captain of his Lion Knights. Then he asked after Adele, whom he had not laid eyes on since she was small. Charlie waved toward the second carriage, calling for Adele to come out and not keep her Uncle Ford waiting. Everyone looked. The carriage did not move at all. My father turned to Charlie in confusion, and Charlie had no idea what was happening either. He hurried over, knocked, and called her name and got no answer. When there was still no movement inside, he crushed the lock in his fist and hauled the door open. There was no Adele in there at all, only a maid slumped unconscious, drugged into a dead sleep. Adele's disappearance sent Charlie into a flustered panic. Nobles prized face above almost everything, and an Adele who simply vanished after a sealed marriage alliance amounted to slapping the whole Grey family across the face. Charlie had no wish to make an enemy of his old commander, having seen how vicious my father could be toward the people he hated. He used battle chi to shake the drugged maid awake. She came to slowly, and the first thing she saw was her own family head staring down at her, so she dropped to her knees, stammering. Charlie asked her where Adele was. The maid looked around, saw no sign of her young lady, and dissolved into panic, insisting she truly did not know. In the morning, the young lady had asked her to share some dessert, she said. A heavy drowsiness had pulled her under right after, and the next thing she knew, the family head was waking her. Charlie's hanging heart went cold, and my parents studied the empty carriage with grave faces. I raised an eyebrow at the whole mess, running out on a marriage. First time I had ever witnessed one. My father fixed Charlie with a hard stare and told him, in a very serious voice, that he needed a reasonable explanation. Ford's tone had turned heavy. He and Charlie had fought side by side once, but this touched the face of the Grey family, and as its head, he had no choice. Charlie took a few deep breaths, nodded, and said nothing, since with no information yet, blind explanations would only muddy the water. Instead, he began combing the carriage for clues, and almost at once he found an envelope tucked in the cabinet beneath the little side table. He tore it open and read. Adele had written that she had gone, that she had left with Harin, that Harin was her true destination and a man who was kind, brave, and upright. She wrote that Harin was practically an angel next to the notorious Rain, and that although I had won the duel against Damon, it changed nothing about how she saw me. She admitted she knew this would drag the family down, and begged her father to let his daughter be willful just once. She signed it as his loving Adele. Reading his daughter's letter drained the strength out of Charlie, and he sagged against the carriage, muttering that she was such a foolish girl. My father asked whether he had found anything, and Charlie wordlessly handed the letter over. Ford read while Charlie laid out the reasons. He did not know exactly when Harin had started contacting Adele, but it had to have been months, and he had already looked into the man. Harin was a mercenary with no small reputation, and a worrying character. One face in public and another behind it. Charlie swore he had warned Adele long ago that Harin was no good, and she had simply refused to believe him. Ever since Lord Jonas had come to discuss the engagement, he went on, he had kept Adele confined and barred from any contact. He had never once imagined his well-behaved daughter would pull this. Ford passed the letter to my mother, and after reading it she frowned hard too. My father told Charlie he was disappointed in him, and that a few peaceful years in the royal capital had cost him the vigilance he once carried in the Night Order. Charlie lowered his head, because letting a first-rank warrior of a daughter slip out from under his nose was indeed his own failing. My mother looked between the two men and said the urgent thing now was to find Adele fast. If Adele was still pure, the engagement could go forward, and if she was not, well, that was where I cut in, unhappy. I asked whether we would really still go through with it, and reminded my mother that she knew the nature of mercenaries, men who were never particular about the women they took. Even if Adele were untouched, what if she had been eyed over and pawed at everywhere? Did that still count as pure, and would that not make me the fool? I pointed out that plenty of men swore up and down they had never actually gone all the way, and that such promises were worth exactly nothing. My words left Charlie no room at all, and even my parents fell into thought. Charlie waved his hands and insisted it could never happen, since Adele carried several magic devices and Harin was a mere first-rank warrior with no way to touch her. I asked what happened if Adele took the devices off herself, and that left Charlie with nothing to say. The whole group stood there in silence. In the end, my mother gave the order to sweep the entire city for Adele. Hill and Grey Guards and Shadow Guards poured out and washed over the royal capital like a tide. A stir this large had to be reported to the Emperor, so my father and Charlie set off for the Imperial Palace, and my engagement to Adele was called off in the process. With the two of them gone, an unengaged and thoroughly relaxed version of me scooped up Cicely and headed for my room. I turned my head and flippantly asked Eve whether she wanted to join. Her face went a little pink, and she declined, saying she needed to keep watch on Adele's situation, and that Cecilia alone was plenty to serve me. Then she added softly, that if I ever felt unsatisfied, I could come find her any time. Night. Cecily slept with the tracks of tears still on her cheeks, and I kissed her softly and drew a small whimper out of her before easing out of bed, dressing on tiptoe, and slipping out. Alice and Ailey were guarding the door with flushed faces. From the lingering way they looked at me, I knew exactly how long they had been listening. I gathered them both in and asked Ailey where Eve had gotten to. Ailey's coaxing little voice told me big sister Eve was in the room next door. I pushed open the door to the next room and found Eve with a notebook, studying something on the desk, and the opening door pulled her back to the present. She set the papers down and reported that Miss Adele still had not been found, and that the family heads now suspected she had already left the city. I raised an eyebrow. All this time and still nothing. I asked whether they had used tracking magic or a tracking device. Eve said they had, that the family head had immediately had a mage cast tracking magic, and that it had come up completely useless. I sat on the bed with the two women and narrowed my eyes at that. If tracking magic came up empty, there were only two possibilities. Either Adele had fled the city and gotten very far, or this Horan carried a device that blocked tracking. I asked whether we had portraits of the two, and Eve pulled 2 sheets from the stack and unfolded them. Looking at the girl in the portrait, I could not help remarking that Adele really was a little beauty. But I let the thought hang, memorized both faces, then pulled the two women down with me onto the soft bed. I told Eve I was hungry and to have the kitchen make me something. She asked what I wanted and I told her anything was fine. She rose and went down to the kitchen, and before long she wheeled a dining cart back in. With Alice and Ailey serving me, I ate the fresh, steaming meal. Rewind to noon. Adele had slipped away from the hill convoy and now walked alone through the royal city. In her heart, she recited the address Brother Heron had once given her, the detached house at 173 Valley Breeze Street, in the south of the city. Dressed as gorgeously as she was, she drew every eye in the commoner district, yet the crowd only glanced once before edging away like she carried a plague. Now and then some noble child snuck out to play, and if they got so much as a scrape, it was always the nearby commoners who paid for it. After a long search, Adele finally found Heron's house, and she knocked on the shabby wooden door. A voice she knew called out from the courtyard asking who was there. She said nothing, wanting to surprise him. Heron, hearing no answer, grew impatient and cursed, then stalked to the door and pulled it open. The sight of Adele standing outside shut his brain down completely, and he could only stammer her name. Adele was thoroughly pleased with that stunned expression, and she told him sweetly that she had come to find him. He snapped out of it, hurried her inside, and asked how in the world she was here, cold sweat already breaking on his brow. Adele read the situation and rushed out her plan in an anxious tumble. She had snuck out, she told him, and they should elope, and he should take her out of the royal city so the two of them could live together forever. The word elope hit Haran like the sky caving in on his head. He had only ever approached Adele meaning to marry into the Hill family as a live-in son-in-law. His talent was real, since he had clawed his way to first-rank advanced warrior off a low, nameless breathing technique, and the Hills might well have taken him. With their resources behind him, he could even have contended with the Empire's top geniuses one day. But their secret guards had found him and warned him that Adele was already promised to reign Grey, so he had abandoned the pursuit and turned to other noble daughters. How could a commoner compete with a son of the Grey family, the Lion of the Empire? Now here she stood talking of running away together. He did not dare picture how furious a young master famous for being violent would be. If he were caught, even death might come as a mercy, and neither the Greys nor the Hills would ever let him walk. Hareen looked at the bright, oblivious girl lost in her own happy world, his eyes hollow. His lady was not trying to elope with him at all, he thought bitterly. She was trying to get him killed. This ran dead against everything he had wanted, which was to cling to the nobility, not to provoke it. Even if he handed her straight back, both families would still come for him, so he was a dead man either way. Then he sighed. Over their months of contact, he had learned that Adele wore several protective devices, so force was out of the question. Trickery was no better. He had even tried to consummate things early to force Charlie's hand, but Adele had insisted it wait for their wedding night. Worse, he needed her cooperation now, or the two of them would be run down in no time. He drew a cloak from his magic device and handed it over, telling her to put it on quickly, since it would smother her aura and keep her father from finding her with tracking magic. At the words tracking magic, she nodded and pulled it on at once, then used her battle chi to make the cloak swallow her presence whole. Heron took her out through the back door, and the two of them wound through the narrow alleys. His home was no longer safe, and if he did not want to be found immediately, he had to move fast. Cloaked figures were common enough in the commoner district that they did not stand out. Before long, he brought her to a place only he knew, an underground space beneath an unremarkable courtyard near the city wall, a hole he had once used to hide from enemies. Down in that dugout cave, he took a tattered scroll from his magic device, an extraordinarily precious teleportation scroll he had bought at the old antique ruins market. The scroll could be used 3 times in all, and when he first got it, only 2 charges remained. A while back he had burned another escaping the territory of a fire monster, so now it held a single last use. He could have spent that charge to teleport clear of the royal city and vanish, since even two families this powerful would not squander endless men on one fleeing mercenary. But Harun was bitterly unwilling, the whites of his eyes gone bloodshot. He had mapped out his whole future, and now it lay ruined, leaving him to live like a stray dog. Was there truly no day when a commoner could rise? So Harun decided to go mad, reasoning that even if his gamble failed, he still had the scroll waiting as a way out. Adele's voice broke into his scheming, asking when they would be leaving the royal city. The veins on his forehead jumped, and inwardly he snapped that the city was surely locked down by now, though he swallowed the curse and gave her a smile. He told her they only had to wait a little longer, and that once this stretch passed he would carry her far away. She nodded happily at the empty promise. Now he only had to keep her steady, both to hide their location and to serve the reckless plan taking shape in his head. And once he had settled her, he set about perfecting it. The next morning I woke wrapped in warmth and softness, catching a faint milky scent as I squinted through a yawn. The personal maids had been waiting by the bed a while. Ailey had been held all night and so climbed out of bed with me. The others patted her and teased that her figure was so fine, it was no wonder the young master had liked her best. Sister Eve would dock her pay for sleeping in this late, they warned. Ailey flushed and hunted the floor for her underwear while the envy in the other maid's eyes was plain. I told them I liked every last one of them, and to come help their young master dress. Maeve wheeled in the breakfast cart from the hall, and after I ate I kissed the maids goodbye one by one, and went down to head for the academy. Drake announced our arrival, and I stepped out, drew my schedule from my magic guide ring, and saw that Granny Keeley was teaching me today. The thought of that kind, capable grandmother tugged a faint smile onto my lips. If the old guard could have heard that thought, they would have frozen for a beat before roaring with laughter, since the witch of poison who had once ended countless lives was, apparently, kind. The moment I entered the magician's tower, I found Granny Keeley at a refreshment table in the hall beside a young girl. I greeted her and asked who her companion was. She told me to sit, poured me tea, and introduced the girl as her disciple Callie, who shared her poison attribute talent and would attend lessons alongside me. Callie Richards shot to her feet and bowed, stammering out a nervous hello and a request that I look after her. I waved her back into her seat, told her to look after me too, and said there was no need to be so tense, since I did not eat people. Granny Keeley's eyes warmed at how easily we got on. She finished her black tea, stood and led the way, then slowed to walk abreast of us. She began to say she had heard about my fiancé and let it trail off. I told her it was fine and she should speak freely, because I did not mind. I confirmed that my fiancé had run off with a mercenary named Heron, but the truth was I felt very little about it. The engagement had only existed because of the business with Sophia, so now that it was gone I felt lighter. Granny Keeley had been quietly furious on my behalf, and she saw that I honestly did not care, and her anger cooled. As long as I did not mind, it was fine, she said, and Adele was blind, and once she tracked down the girl and this Heron, she would vent my anger for me. Chatting the whole way, we reached her laboratory, and the instant I stepped inside my eyes went wide. The place was crammed with jars and bottles holding every kind of venomous creature, and in iron cages along the wall sat several people bound tight. Granny Keeley smiled at my surprise and guessed, rightly, that I had never worked with poison magic, then patted Callie's shoulder and had her introduce it. Callie adjusted her round glasses and explained that poison magic demanded a mage master not only the control of toxins, but their very structure. By regulating mana through a magic array, she said a mage could conjure a toxin he knew. Once he understood a great many of them, he could tune their nature and strength with the subtlest touch of power. In a short while, she had walked me through the basics, and with them I finally understood why the lad held so many venomous things. I asked about the people in the cages. Granny Keeley said they were for testing poison, all of them death row prisoners of the Empire. She gestured me into a chair, sat across from me, and told me to give her my hand, since my color looked pale and she wanted to check me over. It did not surprise me that she knew medicine, because anyone who played with poison knew a little healing, and she was a special grade royal physician on top of it. I handed over my right hand, and she used magic to read my condition, and before long a small knowing smile crossed her face. It was nothing serious, she said, and told me to take something. She produced a little green bottle from her magic guide ring and pressed it into my hand, explaining that it held pills she herself had refined. One a day, she said, would replenish the essence and energy I had spent, nourish my body and cultivate my vital yang. Taken over time, it would firm my foundation and clear out hidden injuries. Genuine interest sparked in me, and I hugged her and told her she was the best. She patted my back fondly. Callie, meanwhile, stared at the bottle in a daze. Even when the Emperor came asking, her teacher parted with only 1 or 2 pills at a time, and here she had handed me a whole bottle. Callie knew how hard those pills were to make and how precious the materials were, and her teacher's affection for me left her feeling as though I were the old woman's own grandson. That little interlude over, the old woman began the lesson proper, and because I was so new to poison magic, she spoke slowly and kept everything easy to follow. She named the burning raccoon grass, whose poison made its victim feel as if the whole body were being set aflame, and a magic array formed in her hand almost instantly. A pitch-black needle sprang from it and drove into the leg of a prisoner, and the man loosed muffled, agonized cries to his gagged mouth. Her expression never shifted as she explained that the poison would not kill quickly, but would leave its victim wishing for death. Then she said everything had its antidote. The fruit of the burning raccoon grass could neutralize its own poison, and so could the venom of the frost-cold snake. A second poison needle from her hand soon left the suffering man slumped and panting. She moved on to the venom of the scaled evil scorpion, a poison that struck at the mind, doing no harm to the body but leaving its victim witless or raving. The whole morning passed that way, her catalog of venomous creatures underscored by the wailing of the men in the cages. At noon she called an end to it, and I poured her a fresh cup of tea. I asked whether I might go, and she agreed, then remarked that from how impatient I looked, I had best learn some restraint. She assumed I meant to rush off and test her pill, and I only rubbed my head and did not explain. I told her to send someone to the Grey Estate if she ever needed anything, and that I would handle it flawlessly. She told me to go, and I said goodbye to Callie as she tidied the lab before I left the Magician's Tower. At noon, the dark clouds had swallowed the sun, and the sky hung heavy and gray, as if a downpour were about to break. As I crossed the academy, a few striking juniors and seniors still drifted up to hand me love letters, and I tucked them into my ring and did the math. 2 days had passed. I wondered whether Damon had managed to steal Sophia's underwear. If he did not deliver today, he would have a hard time facing the god of warriors, and at best his battle chi would scatter, at worst his very life would be at risk. Right as I reached the gates, I sensed that something was off. It was too quiet. People still came and went, but it was nothing like the usual bustle, and even the Ward family's carriage was nowhere in sight. Setting aside the other Ward descendants, had Sophia, that cultivation fanatic, taken leave as well? The scene left me genuinely confused, because I had come out a little late today, but not late enough for the place to be this deserted. Drake had been scanning the grounds anxiously, and the moment he spotted me, he ran over. Haran, the man who had eloped with Miss Adele, had surfaced at the central square in the royal city, he told me. That explained where all the noble sons and daughters had gone. They had all rushed off to Central Square to watch the show. Without another word, I boarded the carriage, and Drake drove hard for the heart of the city. Haran stood directly beneath the great statue at the center of Central Square. The Grey and Hill families had gotten the news and reached him first, and they glared at him with open hostility while other nobles streamed in to gawk. All those watching eyes gave Haran an odd flush of accomplishment and the confidence that he had the whole situation in his grip. The thought of what he was about to do had him nearly shaking with excitement. Deciding the crowd was thick enough, he gave Charlie a crisp warrior's salute and asked with false courtesy whether Viscount Hill had been well. Charlie did not waste a breath on him. He shot straight for Haran, meaning to seize him first, because with the man in hand, his years of military experience would wring his daughter's location out of him. Haran saw Charlie charge and whipped a stone from his magic device. The device alone tore gasps from the crowd, since such things were rare and dear, and no one expected a lowly mercenary to own one. Haran shouted for Viscount Hill to stop, and asked whether he truly wanted nude images of his daughter Adele played before this many people. Charlie froze where he stood and glared murder at the stone, an image recording stone. He snarled that it was impossible, that Adele carried 3 defensive treasures, and that a man of Haran's trash strength could never have recorded a thing. Haran only asked, smooth as oil, whether the Viscount cared to bet the stone was empty. He looked calm as a man holding the winning hand, though inside he was strung tight as wire, because he alone knew what the stone did and did not hold. Charlie stared at it and knew he could not take that gamble, not with his daughter's purity on the table. Haran added that Charlie should not bother sending some high-level assassin after him either. The image recording stone was bound to him, he said, and even if he were killed or captured, he could still command it to play its contents. Charlie fell silent, then slowly retreated to stand behind my father. Ford stared at Haran and waved Jonas back from whatever move he had been about to make. A man who showed up holding a so-called image recording stone had clearly come to negotiate, my father observed slowly, and he invited Haran to name his terms. Haran praised the Marquis's sharp eye and confirmed that yes, he had come to bargain. My father did not answer. He looked out over the square and thought it through. Haran being this composed meant he had already secured an escape route, and the recording stone alone could not keep 2 families at bay, and still slip their pursuit. That left only one thing: space magic. My father lowered his head and quietly told Jonas to fetch the family treasure that could seal space, and to lock down the whole of Central Square. Jonas understood at once and melted into a shadow. Right about then, Drake brought our carriage up, calling for people to clear the way and warning that he would not answer for anyone who got hit. The moment they recognized the gray carriage, the crowd split open a path to the center, and Drake delivered me to my father's side. I climbed down and asked why everyone was locked in a standoff. My father explained, and once I had the picture, I simply stood off to the side and watched as though none of it touched me. After a while, my father looked at Haran and asked, slowly, what he wanted. Haran named a high-level breathing technique and 10 third-tier battle chi treasures. Brant Mick, forever at odds with my father, jeered from the sidelines like a man enjoying a play. For all the Grey family's wealth, he sneered. A boy who asked for so little had plainly never seen the world. Haran said nothing to that. If he demanded too much, more than Adele was truly worth, the Hills might just give up and smash the pot. And then what would the whole scheme have been for? My father spared Brant a single glance and looked away. Since Haran had said nothing about a carriage or about them not following him afterward, my father grew more certain the man was holding a rare teleportation scroll, though he could not guess its grade. He told Haran it was fine, but that he had to give up Adele's location first. Haran asked him not to be so impatient and promised that once the goods arrived, he would naturally tell everyone where she was. Brant sneered again and lost interest. Ford held Haran in his gaze a long moment, then withdrew it and said only to wait. Time crawled, and the dark clouds thickened until it seemed a massive storm was about to fall. Before long, Jonas returned and reported that the space around Central Square had been sealed. Ford nodded and signaled Charlie that the goods could be brought out, and Charlie passed the look to his guards. Soon, 2 Hill family men carried a box into the square. I was watching all of this with great interest when a stranger appeared in front of me. The matter I had arranged with young Master Damon was done, he said, and this was what I had asked for, and he pressed a very exquisite box into my hands. I examined it at once. Surely, inside was Sophia's underwear. Judging the moment ripe, my father told Haran the goods were all here, and that he should now give up Adele's location. Haran smiled thinly and said of course, then added that he wanted just one more thing, an item that would be no trouble at all for a man like the Marquis. The sudden new demand made my father frown and tell him to speak. Haran said he wanted the box young Master Rain was holding right now. Something in that little box had made a spoiled noble like me light up with interest, so Haran decided it had to be worth having. Even a magic treasure a warrior like him could never use would fetch a fat price resold. His words dropped Central Square into dead silence, every eye swinging off him and onto me. The crowd watched me turn the box over, wondering what treasure could hold my attention. Only Brant Mick, tucked back into his family's ranks, was fighting down a laugh, because he was the one man there who knew exactly what sat inside. He shrank deeper into the crowd and prayed I would not notice him, since the moment the lid came off I might drag Damon into it too. The last thing Brant wanted was to answer to a daughter-obsessed Fabian Ward. For years I had been the one snatching things off other people. Getting robbed for a change was almost refreshing. I looked up and told Haran, half amused, that in all my life only I, Rain Gray, had ever taken things from others, and I had never expected the tables to turn today. I rubbed the lid with my thumb, squinted at him, and asked whether he was truly sure he wanted my things, because I doubted he had the life left to spend them. He laughed and shot back that gambling his life was precisely what he was doing right now. Nobody in the square knew what the box held, yet my expression told them all it had to be something precious. My father hesitated, glanced at Charlie Hill beside him, then drifted over and asked me under his breath what was in the box. I honestly did not know how to answer him. Was I supposed to say it was Sophia Ward's underwear? Right here? Out loud? Ford would break my backside open on the flagstones, and even if he held himself back, there was still Sophia herself at the Ward patriarch's side, watching the whole show, so I only told my father that whatever it was, the box could not be handed over, my meaning plain without the details. I would die before I gave it up. If this many people saw that underwear, I would have no face left in the royal city, though I had never carried much face to begin with. Ford tried to reason with me, telling me to hand the box over and see what Haran meant to do, promising the man could not run because the square was already sealed. Even with wings, he said, Haran could not escape today. I refused flatly. My father sighed and offered me a tier 4 treasure to let it go, and I kept my face thoughtful and stayed unmoved. He raised it to tier 5, and at that my eyes lit right up, because a tier 5 treasure was worth at least 10,000 source points. No amount of dignity ever felt as solid in the hand as treasure. I asked him, a little suspicious, whether he really meant it, half afraid old Deng would go back on his word. He grunted that he did, and I told him it was a deal. Seeing us settle, Haran asked eagerly, "How about it, young Master Rain Gray?" I fiddled with the box without glancing his way and told him that giving it to him was not impossible, but he would have to trade the recording stone in his hand for it. He was stunned for a beat, then said of course he could. I told him to have Viscount Hill find an ordinary bystander to carry the goods over. Charlie waved his hand, his guards pulled a commoner from the crowd, and the man ferried the 2 boxes to Haran's side. Heron waved him off warily, then opened both boxes and checked the breathing technique and the treasures inside. Once satisfied, he swept them into his magic device and reached for my little box on the ground, wanting to see what had made me look so greedy. I told him to hand over the recording stone first. He smiled and said not to be so anxious, that he would give it to me once he saw what was inside, and then he slowly lifted the lid. For a heartbeat, it seemed a white light spilled out of the thing. Heron looked in and nearly forgot to breathe, frozen where he stood, gaping down at a pure white bra and a pair of panties with a little bow. Overhead, as if the heavens were in on the joke, a thunderclap rolled across the sky and exploded in every heart in the square. The next moment, every face, Heron's included, turned toward me. Under all those strange stares, my old borrowed face flushed a little, and I coughed twice and looked away. The crowd's eyes went first to shock, then to confusion, and finally, after a good long look at me, to a kind of relief. Fair enough, this was very Rain Gray. From me, a stolen pair of underthings surprised nobody. Ford's mouth twitched, because this stranger's underwear had just scammed him out of a whole Tier 5 treasure. Not bad, his expression said. I really did know how to fleece my own old man. Harin, still not believing his eyes, dug through the box for anything else, and finally turned up a folded note. He read it aloud before he could stop himself, and the note said that Sophia Ward's underwear was pink today. Another thunderclap struck every heart in the square, and as one, the whole crowd swung their gazes towards Sophia and Fabian. The two of them sat stunned a moment, having come to watch other people's melons only to find the melons splattered on themselves. But Fabian recovered fast. The gentle patriarch roared that Haran was full of filth, snatched his long spear from thin air, and hurled it at the man who had slandered his daughter. Charlie and Ford had not expected the scene to turn like this, and my father lunged forward to knock the spear aside. Haran had already been terrified stiff by Fabian's killing intent, so he tore a teleportation scroll and vanished in an instant. The scroll was of an extremely high grade, high enough that even the Gray family space-sealing treasure could not hold it. Ford caught the spear out of the air, stared at the empty patch where Haran had stood, and felt his veins bulge. The man had actually run. Right then a ray of sunlight cut through the dark clouds and fell on the white underwear still lying on the ground. It shone in the light like the only bright thing left in the world. Everyone stared for a beat, then, of course, turned their eyes back to me. I had already darted over to scoop up the underwear and the recording stone. I stood there a second, then loudly complained that the recording stone was empty, and the brat had lied to me, hoping to steer the conversation anywhere but the underwear. Nobody took the bait. Fabian fixed me with an eagle's glare and told me I owed him an explanation. I ducked behind Ford and told Uncle Fabian, all innocence, that he could not go trusting a villain's word, because only that thief had seen the writing on the note. None of us actually knew what it had said. Fabian narrowed his eyes and started hunting for the note, but it had gone with Haran through the teleport. My father, meanwhile, was watching me with his own dangerous meaning behind his eyes, and I read it perfectly. I had told you not to provoke Sophia, that look said, and now wait until we get home. Still wanting a Tier 5 treasure on top of it, it added, 500 slaps would be about right. Then something tugged at my senses. I spun to Ford and told him to hurry, to lift the spatial seal, fast. My sudden seriousness startled everyone, but my father reacted at once and threw Jonas a look, and Jonas dissolved into streaks of black shadow and was gone. A moment later, I felt the seal peel away, and I teleported instantly, chasing a thin silver thread that only my eyes could see. The thread was already fading, but my movements were faster, flicker after flicker through the air. The dean's lesson surfaced in my mind as I ran. Spatial magic perception, he had called it, and here it was, painting Haran's escape route in silver. The farce at Central Square finally wound down. Nobles and commoners alike drifted off to spread the tale. Sophia climbed into her carriage with her maid, but her heart would not settle for a long while. She wanted desperately to deny the underwear had been hers, and yet the facts kept pointing the wrong way, because that style was exactly the kind she wore. Her clothes were custom made by the family tailor, so almost no one else could own the same pair, and the note had been right. She really was wearing pink today. She threw the carriage window open, glared in the direction I had fled, and spat that I was a lecher, a scoundrel, a pervert. The maid watching from the side finally understood that the underwear truly did seem to belong to her young lady. I flashed through the air over the royal city with the heads of several great houses strung out behind me, and before long we cleared the city wall. Flying was forbidden inside the capital. The city guards spotted a knot of figures streaking overhead, and one green recruit opened his mouth to order us down, only for his captain to clamp a hand over it. The captain hissed that the boy must be tired of living, that those were the patriarchs of the great families, and that even the Imperial Guard would not dare stop them. The recruit covered his own mouth and watched us leave, astonished. Teleportation drank mana by the mouthful, and spatial mana in the open air ran thin. Without the Heaven Abyss meditation quietly refilling my reserves, I would have run dry long ago at this pace. Before long, the silver thread led me to a forest outside the capital, and there the spatial ripples simply died out. At the spot where it vanished, I found a damaged scroll, and beside it, a note. I palmed the note fast and hid it deep in my magic device, because if Fabian at my back caught sight of it, I would never clear my name. For now, every bit of blame needed to stay pinned on Haran. Who told him to insist on opening the box in public? He could have simply taken it and walked. I held up the broken scroll for the others and said Haran could not have gone far. Brant Mick's pupils tightened when he saw it in my hand. The kid could really track a man off nothing but the faint mana ripples recorded in some book. His estimate of me climbed a few points on the spot. Fabian looked even more frantic than my father and urged us to split up and search, wearing the face of a man who would not rest until Haran was dead. Brant nodded too, thinking privately that if he found Haran first, he could squeeze forward for a share of the molten stone mine. So the three of them each picked a direction and scattered. I watched them go, then squinted down at the scroll in my hand. Damaged and useless as it was, my eyes still read a fair amount of source energy locked inside it, and I decided Haran's luck really had been something. But luck runs out. Among the countless magic arrays that hovered in my sight, one lit up, and a thread of dark golden magic slid off my fingers to wrap the scroll. There would still be traces of Haran's aura clinging to it, and the breath-tracking technique would sniff him out. Sure enough, once the dark golden mana settled over the scroll, it drifted up and leaned steadily in one direction. I fed it more mana, the scroll picked up speed, and I followed close on its tail. Haran sat crammed into a hidden tree hollow deep in the forest, giddy with himself. He gloated under his breath that all these nobles, all these so-called 6th-rank Moon Knights, were nothing more than toys he had played like a fiddle. Every time he thumbed through his hoard of treasures, a warm, unearned sense of triumph rose in him. Once the high burned down, he grew calmer and told himself he could not stay in the Empire any longer, that he would slip off to the Pollux Federation. There, they said, everyone was equal and only talent and strength counted. Once he cultivated to real power, he would come back and grind the Grey family and the Ward family under his heel. I told him it was a pity he might never cultivate to anything at all. The voice at his back stood his hair on end. He whipped around to find me lounging at the mouth of the hollow, watching him with a playful look while the last of the scroll's mana bled away beside him. Seeing no one else with me, he let out a breath. He had heard I once beat a first-rank advanced warrior, but that had been a duel between nobles, and a pampered scion like me had surely never seen real blood. His tone dropped from oily courtesy to something vicious, and he said that since I insisted on chasing him, he would just have to send me on my way. A long sword flashed into his hand and he charged. I waved a hand and loosed burning flame magic at him, a spear of fire carrying a monstrous heat. He sneered, threw up his left arm to block, and kept coming. But the moment the fire touched that arm, it seemed to lose its nerve and scattered off to either side, without leaving a mark. The sudden turn caught me flat. Fire magic, useless. Before I finished the thought, Haran was on me, his blade sweeping down, and another magic array flared in my eyes. Magic wind resistance. A violent gale ripped up around me and flung him back. He stumbled several steps before catching his footing, his contempt for me suddenly gone as he stared at the faint dark gold rimming my body. Then he attacked again. A few exchanges told me the truth. He was immune to fire and only fire. To any mage born with nothing but fire talent, he would be a natural nightmare. But I had every attribute there was, so if fire would not bite, I still had lightning, and I still had light. The tree hollow came apart under my magic in short order, and the fight spilled out among the trees. Teleportation kept him from ever closing the distance, and when he tried to lose me around the trunks, I answered every dodge with wide sweeping area magic. Before long, he was beaten past the point of standing, and as he sagged unconscious, I let the thunder spear in my hand dissolve, because I had come to capture him, not kill him. Adele's whereabouts were still unknown. From the sky, the watching marquises sighed at my strength, a first-rank beginner putting down a first-rank advance without breaking a sweat. I drew a pair of specially forged shackles from my magic device and used magic to lock them around Haran's wrists from a distance. These were criminal restraints made by the Empire to suppress the battle chi of anyone they bound, so once they clicked shut, Haran had no fight left in him. I stepped in and stripped his gear. While I searched him, I found a long feather lashed to his left arm with a few strips of cloth. The ancient book gave me no energy index for it, but its vivid fiery red already spoke of something rare. The fire mana packed into it was so pure that looking at it through my magic eyes was almost like staring into a small sun. On a hunch, I condensed a little fireball and shot it at the feather, and sure enough, before it even made contact, the flame melted away to both sides. So this was the source of his fire immunity. Confiscated. Confiscated. Every last piece of it confiscated. The feather went straight into my magic guide ring, and after it went the 10 tier 3 treasures from Haran's ring. After those went every strange odd and end he carried whose use I could not even guess. The kid had been sitting on a surprising hoard, a high-grade teleportation scroll, a specially made image recording stone, and now this mysterious feather. If you spoke in the terms of my previous life on Blue Star, he was practically a little child of destiny. The thought pulled my lips into a shape that no doubt looked thoroughly villainous, but my hands never slowed, and last of all, I took a necklace from around his neck. The necklace dropped into my ring just as Haran stirred awake. He looked at the shackles, his eyes dull, and then a spark crept into them. He called me young Master Rain Grey and admitted I had won. He offered to tell me Adele's location and, on top of that, hand me a lucky chance if I would only spare his little life. A lucky chance from a self-styled little child of destiny. That was interesting enough that I told him to go on. He brightened, then arranged his face into difficulty and said the matter of the chance touched his very survival, so perhaps he might give me Adele's location first. I nodded, wanting her whereabouts anyway, and asked where she was. He answered without hesitation that she was in the basement of a small courtyard near the western city wall. A courtyard with no number but 2 Sirs trees out front. Easy to find. I nodded, took up the chain and prepared to haul him back. He panicked at once, thinking of noble punishments that ran worse than death, and begged me to slow down and remember the lucky chance. I told him he could talk while we walked. He looked pained and asked me to release him first, swearing the chance was extraordinary, and when I stayed unmoved he grew truly desperate and blurted that it concerned a secret realm. At those 2 words the forest seemed to hold its breath. My eyes went wide with plain disbelief as I turned slowly to face him, and even the 3 men in the sky broke off their talk. Ford recovered first, and warned the other 2 that this was a chance for the younger generation, and the old things had better not try to snatch it. Brant would have none of that, arguing that whoever saw a windfall shared in it, that he and Fabian had sweated to help the Grey family run Haran down. Surely, he said, their labor was worth something. Fabian nodded along beside him. Ford jabbed a finger at Brant and called him shameless enough to rob children, then dragged up the unsettled grudge over Damon's duel and looked ready to fight him right there in the air. Fabian jumped in as peacemaker, reminding Ford that a secret realm always came trailing a mountain of treasure, and that I could hardly guard it alone. My father barked that the Grey family was not for show, and that whoever dared lay a hand on me could take it up with his Lion Knights first. In the end, Fabian talked him down, pointing out that the whole secret realm was still only a scumbag's word, and the lion finally settled. By then, I had shaken off my shock. A secret realm. It was one of the rarest wonders on the Saltis continent, a small independent world sealed away inside our own. The records said such places had once served the great powers of the ancient era as warehouses, plantations, trial grounds, and proving fields. Large or small, every one of them brimmed with treasure and opportunity. They were so scarce that the origin of the empire itself traced back to a large one, and even now the number in the empire's hands would not fill 2 open palms. I asked Haran flatly whether he even understood what a secret realm was. He answered, confident that a mercenary was not the same as an ignorant man, and of course he knew. That piqued my interest, since even the good-for-nothing former owner of this body had known a secret realm meant a colossal windfall. So I asked why, if he knew, he had not simply gone himself. He said he could not, because it was not yet the realm's time to open. His knowing the opening time only sharpened my curiosity. Haran went quiet, then said he had already shown his sincerity. If I truly wanted the rest, he said, I would have to swear to the magic god to let him go, or he would not breathe another word even in death. I fell into thought, and for a while the forest lay quiet under nothing but distant birdsong. Then I smiled and told him a vow would not be necessary. I could simply take him home, have my Granny Keeley cook up something suitably nasty, and let the poison pry every last secret out of him. His hair stood on end and he stammered that he would sever his own heart meridians and die first, so that I would never learn a thing. I only sneered. Now that he had chosen the secret realm as his ticket to live, how could he be desperate enough to survive and yet ready to kill himself in the same breath? He said grimly that if he died, at least my ignorance would be assured, and he sat waiting for my answer, certain no one alive could resist a secret realm's pull. Sitting cross-legged on the air, I looked down at him and asked, after a while, how I was supposed to know a word he said was true. So he swore to the god of warriors that if I promised to spare him and he told me a single lie within a day, his battle chi would backflow and take his life. As the oath formed, we both felt something in the unseen turn its attention on us, the sign that it had bound. Then I raised my face to the sky and swore my own to the magic god. If Haran told me everything he knew of the secret realm, I would spare his life and never move against him. Otherwise my magic would scatter and I would never advance another inch as long as I lived. The heavy stone in Haran's chest finally dropped. He eyed the shackles hopefully, and I waved him off and asked first whether the location he had given for Adele was true. The oath left him no room to lie, so he confirmed that she was indeed right where he had said. Only then did I step down off my invisible chair, come to his side, and tell him to lean his ear close and whisper the whole matter of the secret realm to me. Up in the sky, the three of them were speechless, because a moment ago I glanced up and clearly clocked all three, and now I was making sure they heard nothing. Brant and Fabian could have used their battle chi to eavesdrop, but Ford blocked them both, jeering that the two old things wanted to spy on the juniors' business too. By rights, they had no standing to listen, and still the reluctance gnawed at them. Ford understood in that instant that an ordinary realm the Grey family could handle alone, but an unusual one might need allies to crack open. So he offered aloud that once I finished questioning Harin, an ordinary realm would belong to the Grey family alone, while another sort would be developed by the three houses together. Brant and Fabian nodded, hungry for a slice of the pie. Before long, Harin had told me all of it. He said he had held nothing back, and that I ought to release him now, or he could not use his battle chi to hand the ownership of the secret realm key over to me. I fished a key from my magic guide ring and tossed it to him, and he caught it, unlocked the shackles, shut his eyes, and after a moment spat out a mouthful of blood. Wiping his lip, he said the secret realm key was mine now. I drew out the necklace I had lifted from his neck, and forced a bead of blood from my fingertip onto it. A faint tie snapped into place between us as the realm's information flooded my mind, matching Harin's account almost exactly. I slipped the necklace on and told him he could go, and he bowed to me with hollow gratitude and walked off toward the trees. I watched his back a moment, then looked up and told my father and uncles to stop hiding and come out. The three of them appeared before me at once. Ford asked, surprised whether Harin had told me what kind of realm this was. He had, I said, but father ought to see to Harin first, since I could not act against him myself, while the fewer people who knew of the realm, the better. Ford caught my meaning instantly and flickered off after the fleeing man. Harin was still drowning in the sweetness of his rebirth when my father materialized in front of him. He had only begun to plead for mercy when Ford's pressure crashed down and crushed his bones in a heartbeat, killing him where he stood. Had the corpse not still held some value in restoring a little of the Grey family's face, that single blow would have burst him into a red mist. Ford pocketed the body and returned in a flash. He came back to find Brant and Fabian already trying to worm the details out of me, so I began to lay it out for all three. This was a trial-type secret realm, I told them, not an ordinary one, and its trial ceiling reached the 4th rank. Anyone entering would face 5 trials, and passing each earned a matching reward, while failure brought no death, only a quiet ejection out of the realm. Their pupils shrank. A ceiling at the 4th rank meant anyone below it could go in and test themselves. What made such realms famous was the old story of a first-rank warrior. He walked in and walked out not only with vastly enhanced talent, but with his strength lifted clear to the 5th rank, a single stride to the heavens. Fabian asked the crucial thing, where the realm was and how many could enter. I shook my head and said the realm had no fixed location, but that anyone holding the key could step straight inside once it opened. The three of them frowned, since there was only one key in my hand, which seemed to mean only I could go. Then I told them the key could record the information of 300 people, and that when the realm opened, those 300 and I would all enter together. They traded looks. 300 was no small number, and only their 3 houses knew of the realm, so 300 slots would be more than enough. I opened my mouth to walk them through the finer cautions, but Ford cut me off. For all his rough edges, the man was careful, and the quotas had not been settled with Brant and Fabian yet, so it was far too early for the rest. Then we all turned back. Ford carried me home himself, and where the trip out had crawled at the other's pace, the return took only minutes. Charlie was pacing the estate, waiting. He saw us land, and, anxious as he was, still bowed and greeted the 3 marquises, and then me. My father clapped him on the shoulder and laughed that he really ought to thank me properly this time, since without me they never would have run Harin down. The news that Harin was caught lit Charlie up, because it meant his daughter had surely been found. He bowed to me and poured out his gratitude, swearing the Hill family would forever be the Grey family's most loyal supporter. I waved off the formality and told him to go find Adele first, then passed along the location Harin had given.